Chapter 238. The climate of the plateau changed rapidly, and the temperature difference between day and night was huge. All the temperature came from the direct sunlight. Therefore, when the sun was covered by the thick dark clouds, the temperature suddenly dropped a lot. Due to the effect of the atmospheric thermal circulation, the wind during the day would blow from the bottom of the valley to the top of the mountain. However, at night, the wind would blow from the top of the mountain to the valley. This phenomenon was the so-called valley wind. Although it was still morning, because the sun was blocked by the dark clouds, the mountain wind began to blow from the top of the mountain to the bottom of the valley. Chun-Shi and the others drove in the Cleaking River Valley. The mountain wind suddenly blew, and the snowflakes dancing in the sky suddenly scattered into the valley. The sky was dark, and the heavy snow gradually blurred the vision. The driver was a scout under Tian Runching. After seeing the situation, his reaction was very fast. He drove the all-terrain vehicle directly to the rocky slope on the side of the valley. As the saying went, there are not many avalanches on rocky slopes in dense forests, but there are more avalanches on slopes where snow eaves are lee of the wind. Both sides of the Cleaking River Valley were full of glaciers and snow. It was very dangerous to stay in the valley when the wind blew, because if you were not careful, you could be buried alive by the snow. The military all-terrain vehicle used tank tracks. It ran along the 70 to 80-degree snow slope as if it was running on flat ground, kicking up a lot of snow as it went straight to the mountainside. When the slope was less than 20 degrees, it was generally impossible for an avalanche to occur. Therefore, when the all-terrain vehicle drove into the valley, it directly rushed toward the open and gentle slope. The Siaking Glacier was the largest of the many glaciers in the vicinity. The snow fell from the top of the Karakora Mountains to the valley and finally formed such a large glacier. This place was barren, and there were no animals, so it was also called the end of the world. The Hindustani army had been stationed in the Siaking Glacier for nearly 30 years. In the past 30 years, the number of Hindustani soldiers who died because of non-war reasons had reached as high as 9,000 people. This was the shady side of the mountain, and the conditions were much worse than the beach at the end of the river. The Hindustani soldiers were at such a high altitude, and it was very difficult for them to eat and walk. In addition to physical injuries such as amputation and frostbite, they also had to endure prematurely aging, memory loss, impotence, and other conditions caused by environmental factors. These brought great mental stress to the soldiers. Therefore, the end of the world was not necessarily heaven, but hell. The snowstorm was getting heavier and heavier. Like a summer shower, the violent mountain winds carried countless snowflakes as they whistled from the horizon. A blizzard was coming. Seeing this, the driver had no choice but to stop the car next to a huge rock. The three all-terrain vehicles formed a temporary position in a tripartite formation. The group could only sit in the vehicles and wait for the blizzard to subside. In Chun-Shi's car, other than the driver, Tai Dan Li, and Xue Shu Jin, the rest were all scientific researchers who were national treasures. After the middle-aged man called Professor, he glanced at the situation outside the window. He couldn't help but frown and muttered to himself, "I contacted the Weather Detection Center before we set off. Today should be a sunny day. Why is there a sudden snowstorm?" When a scholar next to Professor he heard this, he couldn't help but laugh. Is the weather forecast reliable? These words amused the people in the carriage, and they couldn't help but shake their heads and laugh. In fact, with the current technology, the weather forecast was quite accurate. At least within a few hours, the accuracy rate would be as high as 90%. The people in the room were all environmental and climate experts, so this was more like a joke. Just as they were chatting and relaxing, the driver seemed to hear a rumbling sound. However, the wind outside was too loud, so he wondered if he heard wrong. Therefore, he poked his head forward and continued to observe through the front window. The driver looked for a while, but because his vision was completely blocked by the blizzard, he couldn't see anything clearly. Suddenly, Chun-Shi, who was sitting in the passenger seat with his eyes closed, opened his eyes. "Sit in the car, don't move." After Chun-Shi said this, he opened the car door. The driver was dumbfounded. The car was heated by an engine, so it was very warm inside. However, The temperature outside was already as low as minus 50 degrees. What did minus 50 degrees mean? Even peeing would cause a parabola to appear in the air. Chun-Shi suddenly walked out of the car in this snowstorm. As a security guard, Ironly couldn't just sit by and watch. Therefore, he called out, "Brother Chun-Shi," loudly and tried to get out of the car to drag him back. However, no matter how hard Ironly tried, he could not open the car door. After trying to no avail, Ironly had no choice but to lean against the window anxiously. He kept banging on the window in an attempt to call Chun-Shi back. Chun-Shi didn't look back. His figure quickly disappeared into the snowstorm. Ironly could only make a sound that was close to a wail. Actually, the driver didn't hear wrong. There was indeed a rumbling sound outside. It wasn't the sound of the wind, but an avalanche. The motorcade was parked in a relatively gentle location. Normally, there was no way they would be affected by an avalanche. However, for some reason, two nearby mountains experienced an avalanche at the same time. Snow poured down from the top of the mountain like a flood. It was getting bigger and bigger, splashing up countless snowflakes as it pressed down from the top of the mountain. This sudden avalanche was not an ordinary pine snow avalanche. It was the most deadly type of avalanche. The snow had already turned into ice. Huge chunks of ice kept falling down like rolling stones. It was at least a few million tons. Millions of tons of snow rolled down from the top of the mountain faster and faster. Like two white snow dragons soaring through the clouds, they whizzed down along the two sides of the mountain, bringing with them a majestic and unparalleled power, sweeping away everything in their path. At this rate, the motorcade would be flattened by the snow before they could leave. After all, in front of the fury of nature, humans were extremely small. Chun-Shi stood in the vast expanse of white snow, as if she was touching a piece of white paper with a pen, almost imperceptible. Due to the acceleration of gravity, the snow was falling faster and faster. In the end, it was almost 100 meters per second, which was 360 kilometers per second. This was the speed of a top supercar. In a momentum formula derived from Newton's second law, Ft equals mv. Then there was a problem. Millions of tons of snow falling at a speed of 100 meters per second. How much impact would it have on the objects below? Chun-Shi raised his head. His gaze pierced through the snow and saw the situation on the mountain. Then, a long sword of frost and snow suddenly appeared in his hand. Boom! The two white dragons collided on the plains where the motorcade was located. In an instant, a powdery snow cloud hundreds of meters high was set off. In an instant, there was only a vast expanse of whiteness left. Chapter 239. The two avalanches almost reached the foot of the mountain at the same time, and then collided on the plateau below. But because the angle was less than 45 degrees, the collision did not slow down the momentum of the avalanches. Instead, the power of the two avalanches suddenly gathered in one place. The two white snow dragons instantly merged into one, and with an even more violent momentum, they continued to fiercely pounce on the plateau below the mountain. The snowstorm filled the sky, and the snow clouds wreaked havoc. The white dragon roared at the sky, and the rumbling sound was like winter thunder, constantly reverberating and shaking the mountains more than 6,000 meters above sea level. Just listening to the sound was enough to make people's hearts tremble. This violent force of millions of tons did not stop after pouncing from the top of the mountain to the foot of the mountain. Instead, with an unstoppable force, it continued to pounce forward along the slope. Everywhere the snow dragon passed, a thick snow fog rose. Large amounts of powdery snow clouds with ice shards, like fragments of grenades exploding, constantly shot in all directions. If someone was standing nearby, they would probably be shot into a sieve on the spot. When the frost and snow cleared, only a thick layer of snow was left behind the snow dragon. The snow layer was like soft cotton candy, spreading out on the plateau. It looked like it was at least 10 meters thick. If such a shocking scene was recorded by a camera and uploaded to the internet, it would probably cause a sensation in the world. From the avalanches pouncing to the foot of the mountain, and then to the exhaustion of the power on the plateau, the whole process did not take more than 5 minutes. However, in this short span of 5 minutes, this shocking avalanche destroyed everything within a 10-kilometer radius along its path. After everything calmed down, it was as if there was only a vast expanse of white snow left between heaven and earth. Other than the pure white snow, there was nothing else. And just as the avalanches were wreaking havoc and destroying everything, two figures suddenly appeared on the mountain peak in the distance. It was a man and a woman. The two of them stood on a large rock on a mountain peak, quietly overlooking everything below through the wind and snow. The land of extreme cold, the peak of the snowy mountain. The man wore a pleated long-sleeved shirt that reached his knees, with a slit on his neck and complicated and exquisite decorations, and a long navy blue shawl on his shoulders. The most eye-catching feature was the hat on his head, which was wrapped in a turban. Just like Huasia's Hanfu, this man was actually wearing a traditional Indian costume, toddy. Men wore toddy, and women naturally wore exquisite and gorgeous saris. This woman was about 30 years old. Time did not leave any traces on her face. Her graceful figure was set off by the silk sari, which made her look even more charming. There was a red between her eyebrows, which set off her deep eyes and slightly brown skin. That unique charm that only belonged to the Indian beauty was enough to make any man in this world fall head over heels for her. Like many Indians, the two of them did not wear shoes. Their slightly tanned skin was particularly eye-catching against the snow. However, if one were to look closely, they would discover that they were actually floating on top of the snow, about an inch off the ground. India had a tropical monsoon climate with high temperatures throughout the year. Their attire was nothing special in India. But where was this place? Siachen Glacier. The blizzard was howling, and the temperature was as low as minus 50 degrees, but they did not seem to feel the cold at all. Obviously, these two were powerhouses from India. When the man saw that the avalanche had completely submerged the place where the convoy was, a trace of disdain flashed in his calm eyes. Then, he turned around and seemed to be ready to leave. But just as the man was about to leave, he suddenly seemed to have sensed something and hurriedly turned back to look in that direction. The clouds dispersed, and only a thick layer of snow was left in the plateau. The three all-terrain vehicles were not buried under the snow. Instead, they were strangely flying in the air. After the avalanche subsided, the three all-terrain vehicles that weighed nearly 10 tons slowly fell from the air. Then, as if they had fallen into a swamp, they kept sinking. It was not until the snow completely swallowed the vehicle's tracks that the three all-terrain vehicles finally stopped sinking. Although the sky was filled with snow, the man could still clearly see this scene. But soon after, the arrogance on his face couldn't help but turn into surprise. Because in addition to the three unscathed all-terrain vehicles, he suddenly saw a figure. A silhouette hovered in the air, seemingly holding a weapon in his hand. Looking carefully, he found that the person was slightly raising his head and looking at him in the air. The snowstorm was still the same. After Chun, she slowly put the vehicle on the snow. He turned his head and looked at the mountain peak in the distance. The convoy had just arrived at the Siachen Glacier when they encountered this devastating avalanche. Obviously, it was caused by the two people in front of him. In that case, it would be impolite not to reciprocate. Then, he raised his sword to the sky and slashed out. A green light flew out from the tip of Chun-Shi's sword. After Chun-Shi slashed out with her sword, the sword shadow that was originally only 3 feet long grew larger and more solid with every inch that it flew higher into the sky. It grew at a speed that was almost visible to the naked eye. In the blink of an eye, the sword light that was hundreds of feet high rushed into the sky and slashed at the mountain peak where the man and woman were. The shadow of the sword light came down from the top, and the sword edge directly hit the mountain peak. Boom! With an earth-shattering sound, there was a violent explosion at the mountain peak. Boulders, soil, glaciers, and snow all exploded. It was like blowing up an abandoned high-rise building. This sword directly split the mountain peak into two. The flying boulders continued to slide down from the mountain and fell to the ground, making a series of dong-dong-dong sounds. It was as if someone was beating a drum. The drum beats were dense and did not stop. The boulders hit the ground heavily, and a huge impact caused the entire ground to begin to shake. If it was not for the fact that there had been a big avalanche just now, there would probably be an even bigger avalanche now. The mountain wind was biting cold, and the snowstorm was raging. The dust and gravel raised by the explosion were instantly blown away by the wind. Looking into the wind and snow, the sharp mountain peak was actually split in half by Chunxi's sword. Half of it had fallen down the mountain, and the other half was still on the verge of collapse. Finally, under the continuous attack of the strong wind, the remaining half of the mountain could no longer hold on. With a series of loud, rumbling sounds, this half of the mountain peak collapsed heavily from the mountain peak. Chapter 240. I have a sword. It can split mountains and break peaks like a hot knife through butter. After he swung his sword, a small part of the towering mountain peak was instantly chopped off by Chunxi. His current appearance was the complete opposite of his usual amiable and approachable appearance. Holding the frost snow longsword in his hand, he stood in the air, his body exuding an awe-inspiring aura. After Chunxi split the mountain peak with his sword, a figure suddenly appeared on top of the mountain range. Judging from his appearance, he was an Indian. That person was covered in dust, his hair was tied up in a bun, he wore a crescent moon on his head, and a long snake around his neck. He wore a string of skulls on his chest, and a tiger skin around his waist. This getup was very strange, but the strangest part was that he actually had 4 arms, and there was a third eye in the middle of his forehead. The third eye in the middle of his forehead was like a pool of blood, dark red and eerie. As the pupil moved, it constantly emitted a cold and evil feeling. His 4 arms were holding a trident, an axe, a tambourine, and a club. This getup looked somewhat similar to the Black Bhairav statue in the square of the Kathmandu Palace. The so-called Black Bhairav statue was actually Mahakala Mahakala. Mahakala was one of the 3 main gods of India, Shiva's incarnation, in charge of creation and destruction. So, this figure that suddenly appeared should be the legendary Shiva. Seeing this, Chunxi could not help but laugh coldly. Originally, his understanding of Indian cultivators was completely blank, but after this figure appeared, Chunxi instantly found the other party's cultivation core from this figure. Dharma. The great Tao flowed like mercury, and every grain was round. As one of the 4 ancient civilizations, India was not as bad as people thought. On the contrary, many aspects of Huaxia civilization were even influenced by Indian culture. Religion was one aspect, but the cultivator behind it was the key. After this figure appeared, it rapidly expanded at a speed visible to the naked eye, and finally reached a height of more than 10 meters. From afar, it was like Buddha had descended, hovering in the sky, quietly looking down at the mountains below. In reality, it was not a physical body, but a phantom. But if one looked closely, they would realize that this phantom was actually similar to a mirage and somewhat like a 3-dimensional projection technology, pretending to be mysterious. Just as Chunxi swung his sword and was about to release another sword gleam, the phantom suddenly spoke. The Brahmins and the Wu Yin of Huaxia had an agreement, with the Himalayas as the boundary and not invading each other. Are you going to violate this agreement today? The Shiva statue's lips were slightly opened, and its 4 arms were gently waving. It looked like this giant statue was talking. His Mandarin was not very fluent, so it sounded a little awkward. However, his voice was deep and resounding. After he finished speaking, his voice continued to reverberate in the mountains. Agreement? Didn't you want to bury us alive with an avalanche? Isn't it too late to talk to me about an agreement now? At this point, Chunxi suddenly pointed the tip of his sword and smiled at the Shiva statue. I don't want to kill more, so I can give you a chance. I suggest you consider it carefully. If you leave now, I can let bygones be bygones, and the so-called agreement is still valid. Chunxi was not bloodthirsty, so just like last time when he dealt with Sunwen, even if the other party attacked first, he chose to give the other party a chance to live. But the person in front of him was fundamentally different from Sunwen, because he was a pure-blooded Indian noble, a Brahmin. In a country like India, with a strict caste system, how could a Brahmin with a supreme status bow down to Huaxia? Therefore, before Chun Shi finished speaking, the expression on the face of the statue was as lifelike as a real person, and it suddenly became furious. The statue let out a roar. The third eye on the forehead suddenly glowed red, and a strange Sanskrit voice echoed among the mountains. Then, a ray of light with a destructive aura shot out from his eyes. Like a laser cannon, it hit Chun Shi in an instant. It was not right to say that it hit, because a golden barrier suddenly rose in front of Chun Shi. The golden barrier blocked the red light. At this time, Chun Shi suddenly released the long sword in his hand. The long sword of frost and snow did not fall, but was suspended in the air. Then, one after another, the long swords of frost and snow continued to condense and take shape behind Chun Shi. He formed a sword with his fingers and pointed in the air. Thousands of long swords of frost and snow immediately raised their sword tips and pointed to the Shiva statue on the top of the mountain. The third move of the moonlight sword technique. 10,000 swords in one. Where your heart goes is where my sword points. The densely packed frost and snow swords converged into a long silver dragon, tearing through the wind and snow. It carried with it a majestic aura that could swallow mountains and rivers as it swept across the sky in a majestic manner. After the 10,000 swords, the whole world was quiet. Only the mountain wind was still whistling. This Indian's cultivation had obviously not reached the level of the divine general, so there was not even an explosion. The frightening Shiva statue was directly torn to pieces by the all swords in one. Why won't you listen to my advice? Chun Shi sighed softly and turned to leave. But at this time, an earth-shattering roar once again rang out from the summit of the mountains. The roar seemed to be full of endless anger and hatred. The voice was extremely loud, like the roar of the surviving species of the untainted land. Just the sound alone had shaken the surrounding mountains and made rocks fall continuously. The power of the roar was so great. Chun Shi looked back in surprise, only to see the statue of Shiva appear on the top of the mountain again. But this time, the statue was not the same as before, but a man and a woman. Although it was a man and a woman, in fact, there was only one person. Just like the conjoined people in Zhang Guorong and Lin Qingxia's version of the legend of the white-haired witch, one side was a man and the other side was a woman. However, it was slightly different from the movie. In the movie, the two actors were simply connected back to back. The statue in front of him used the same body, and the man and woman were connected from neck to neck. The man's side was the same as before, but the woman's side had two more hands, one holding a mirror, the other holding a water bottle. A two-headed, six-armed, four-legged monster appeared in front of Chun Shi. Shiva had many kinds of Dharma appearances. The statue just now was the angry one, and this statue was the extremely rare main half of a woman, which was half of a man and half of a woman. Seeing this, even Chun Shi, who was used to seeing storms, could not help but frown and complain. Chapter 241. Brahma, book creator, Shiva, Mahesvara, and Vishnu, Mahesvara, were known as the three main gods of India. Brahma's position was similar to Pangu, Vishnu was similar to Fushi, and Shiva was similar to Nuwa. Different from Nuwa's compassion, Shiva had one more hobby than Nuwa when he was creating things, and that was destruction. Shiva represented creation and destruction, which was why he was worshipped by the Indians as the main god with the strongest combat power. The huge statue that appeared in front of Chun Shi was obviously not the real Shiva in the legends. It was just an imposter. It was not right to call it an imposter, because this was the cultivation method of the Indians, Dharma. Huaxia's Buddhism came from India, so the cultivation method of Buddhism was also Dharma. However, Chun Shi had only interacted with necromancers and martial artists, so he did not know that Buddhist cultivators had such things as well. The so-called Dharma referred to the appearance of the various Dharma, which was also the external manifestation of mana. The manifestation of Dharma was not used to scare people, but it contained the application of spells. Just like necromancers who would chant spells before making a move, the Brahmin cultivators would reveal Dharma before making a move. The existence of Dharma was similar to a Shikigami. It was a manifestation of the spiritual energy of heaven and earth after it was refined into vital essence. It could not be separated from the cultivator, and the cultivator could use it to attack. The lethality of Dharma was not judged by its appearance or size, but with the arrogant personality of the Indians, the bigger and more terrifying the Dharma, the better. Therefore, when fighting with an Indian cultivator, one only needed to see how big and strange the Dharma behind him was. As for Dharma, it was just like the saying, the great Tao was like mercury flowing on the ground, and every grain was round. The cultivation methods on Earth seemed to be very different, but in reality, they were all the same. This Indian was at most at the level of Sunwin. After being hit by Chanshi's 1,000 returning swords, even if he did not die, he should be severely injured. But now, he was able to stand up again, and the spirit chi around him was twice as strong as before. This situation immediately aroused Chanshi's interest. Shiva had thousands of avatars, and the one with the strongest combat power was the half-woman avatar. This kind of spell that could double one's combat strength out of thin air was really scary when he thought about it carefully. If it wasn't Chanshi who came today, but Sunwin instead, Sunwin would probably have died on the spot. Chanshi closed his eyes, trying to figure out the true essence of this spell from the surging of the spiritual energy of heaven and earth. After the 30-meter tall statue of Shiva appeared, it did not hesitate for a moment and directly roared in the direction of Chanshi. Shiva Natraja. Transliteration. Natraja, Shiva's signature skill. He had 2 heads and 2 mouths, so his roar was naturally very shocking. While it was roaring, the 6 arms of the statue started waving. Although these 6 objects were not all weapons, at this moment, all of them were emitting a strong red light. Immediately after, a red light suddenly appeared at the chest of Shiva's statue. Shiva's third eye actually appeared at his chest. Then, a red pillar of light suddenly shot out from the third eye, heading straight for Chanshi. Chanshi had not spent so much effort to figure out something in a long time. In this world, there was nothing that he needed to figure out for a long time. Thus, at the same time that Shiva roared, Chanshi suddenly opened his eyes and shouted, "Found it!" As his voice fell, the phantom of a giant sword appeared behind him out of thin air. That sword phantom was thousands of feet tall, like a pillar that supported the sky. Its shape was simple, and the sword body was covered in dark diamond-shaped patterns. The sword edge near the sword hilt was cast with strange characters. The blade of the long sword was not straight, and the backbone was clearly formed into a line. The widest part was about 1/3 of the sword hilt, and then it curved inwards until the sword edge protruded outwards and then converged inwards into a sharp point. Although it was a phantom, the sword was covered in green light, and it gave people a feeling that it was as cold as ice and that it could cut through hair. Chanshi did not seem to see the red light emitted by Shiva's statue. Once the sword phantom appeared, he immediately turned to look at the long sword that had been with him for hundreds of years. "Old friend, it's been a long time." Although it was just a phantom, after seeing the sword, Chanshi could not help but let out a long cry. The difficulty of returning to Earth from Heavenly Spiral was not something that ordinary people could imagine. This sword was one of the prices he had to pay to return to Earth. To Chanshi, this was a price that was even heavier than the damage to his soul and the depletion of his vital energy. The cultivation techniques on Earth were still too shallow for Chanshi, so through his observation just now, he had a rough idea of the principle of Dharma manifestation. Therefore, he immediately activated his vital energy and created this peerless divine sword that only existed in his memory. This sword was called Heavenly Divination. I have a sword that dares to go against the world. Chanshi had not been so carefree in a long time. After all, to a man, a happy family and a successful career were his lifelong pursuits. Chanshi already had the former, and the latter was something that he once had. When the Heavenly Divination sword appeared again, the feeling of riding a horse with a sword and singing to the ends of the world came back. Looking at the sword with a cold lamp, how many achievements will the sword have? The incense burner does not care about the common people. Even if a stream of smoke passes away, the clouds are buried, the lonely sun still shines on the ancient tomb. This unlucky Indian cultivator definitely did not know that his appearance had made Chunshi make up for some of the small regrets in his heart. The real thing could not be found, but it was good to make a sample to comfort himself. In order to repay the other party, Chunshi decided to let this Indian cultivator see the set of shocking sword techniques that were compatible with the heavenly divination sword. The 49 forms of heavenly divination sword technique. Painting the sky as the god, condensing the sword as the soul. There is nothing in all directions. This is called the human sword. The human sword of the 3 famous swords. The red light of destruction emitted by the statue of Shiva was very dazzling. But in front of the green light emitted by the long sword, it still accidentally fulfilled that sentence. How can the light of a firefly compete with the brilliance of the sun and the moon? Just the green light, emitted by the thousands of feet long divine sword, completely blocked the red light. Chunshi formed a sword with his fingers and suddenly pointed at the statue of Shiva on the mountain peak. Then, the divine sword suddenly shrank to the size of a normal sword. Then, the tip of the sword suddenly turned and flew toward the statue of Shiva. The sword was 3 feet long. A green rainbow pierced the sky. The divine sword cut through the sky like a green lightning. Like a needle, it suddenly pierced into the chest of the statue of Shiva that was dozens of meters tall. Then, a strong light bloomed on the mountain peak. At that moment, the wind and snow seemed to stop. The originally dark sky suddenly became as bright as day, as if the dark clouds had suddenly dispersed and the sun had once again shone on the Siachen Glacier. The bright light reflected by the ice and snow was comparable to the summer sun, making it impossible to open one's eyes to look at it. The dazzling light lasted for about a minute, then dissipated. The world darkened once again. The snowstorm continued. It was as if nothing had happened. But if one looked carefully, one would discover that there was actually one less mountain in the distance. It was as if a painter was not satisfied with his painting and wanted to erase it and repaint it. Chapter 242. The Indian cultivators were known as Brahmins. Brahmins were a religious name similar to Buddhism, and they also represented the highest class in Indian society. At the same time, they were an organization similar to the Wu Lian in India. This Indian cultivator, who had only met Chunshi once and did not even mention his name, was completely reduced to dust by the attack of the divine sword shadow. Then, he fell to every corner of the Siachen Glacier with the wind and snow. It was not right to say that it was only one person. In fact, it was 2 people, 2 celestial realm cultivators who were comparable to Sunwin. This secret technique that could instantly double one's combat power was called Maithuna among the Brahmins, which was also known as dual cultivation. Dual cultivation originated from the Brahmins of India. It was originally a cultivation method, but after it spread to Huaxia, it was misinterpreted and abused by the Tibetan esoteric sect. It completely became a trick to cheat people and lost its value and meaning. After all, dual cultivation was not as simple as rolling in the sheets. First, one had to find a man and a woman who were of equal talent and had the same mind. They had to cultivate according to the secret technique from a young age, so that they could enter a state of harmony and life and death together. The close connection from the soul to the body allowed their combat power to have a superimposed effect. This kind of shameless secret technique was also the main reason why the martial arts world of Huaxia was generally unwilling to provoke the Brahmins. But then again, celestial realm cultivators were rare. Now that a pair had died, it was a very heavy blow to the Indian Brahmins. Once the news spread back to Huaxia, who knew how many people would clap their hands and applaud. Regarding this, Chunshi didn't have much of a reaction. He silently glanced at the mountain that he had flattened. After confirming that the opponent's aura had completely disappeared, He turned to look in the direction of the convoy. At this moment, a green light flashed. The shadow of the Tian Yin divine sword reappeared beside Qin Shi. After taking a deep look at this old friend that had been with him day and night, Qin Shi gently waved his arm, and the shadow of the divine sword slowly dissipated. This trip could be considered a small gain. Although Qin Shi's understanding of Dharma powers was still too shallow, he had enough cultivation and experience. As long as he was given enough time, he would definitely be able to grasp the true essence of the Dharma idol. He would no longer be able to merely grasp the shape of the Dharma idol. Thinking of this, Qin Shi couldn't help but look up at the dark sky. The real Tian Yin sword might be lying quietly in some corner of the vast universe right now. Iron Egg was leaning against the car window. When he saw Qin Shi's figure appear through the snow, he couldn't help but exclaim in surprise. Because of the limited vision, they had been sitting in the car all this time and did not know what was happening outside. However, everyone could still clearly feel the violent tremor just now. It was as if there was an earthquake, and the car kept shaking. If the all-terrain vehicle was like a tin can, then they were the sardines inside. They could only curl up in the can and pray to God helplessly. In front of nature, human beings were always so insignificant. Iron Egg Lee's face was tense. Because he was overly worried about Qin Shi's safety, his eyes were a little red. He had been trying to open the door, but this all-terrain vehicle was a special military bulletproof vehicle. How could he break it with his bare hands? As soon as Qin Shi unlocked the restriction, Iron Egg Lee violently opened the door. Because he used too much force, he even lost his balance and almost fell off the car. Iron Egg Lee's attention was all on Qin Shi, so he didn't notice that the snow had strangely covered the tracks. Therefore, as soon as he got off the car, he stepped on the thick snow and frantically ran toward Qin Shi. "Mr. Chun, are you okay?" It wasn't easy to be a guard. In times of crisis, not only did he have to use his hands to block the enemy's blade, he also had to sacrifice his body to block bullets for his superior. If anything happened to Qin Shi as a guard, he would be held responsible by the army. The honest Iron Egg didn't understand the concept of EX level. He always thought that Qin Shi only knew a little martial arts. "I'm fine, don't worry." Seeing this, Qin Shi smiled and patted him on the shoulder, indicating that he didn't have to worry. Iron Egg Lee was not good with words. After seeing that Qin Shi was fine, he forced a smile and said, "Mr. Chun, the snow is so heavy, it's very dangerous. If you want to know the situation outside, just let me know. I'm a scout, I specialize in this kind of thing." "Okay, I got it." Hearing this, Qin Shi smiled and nodded. While the two of them were talking, the others got out of the car. The people in Qin Shi's car were all normal people. A few of the professors were blown by the cold wind and immediately shivered, so they quickly got back into the car. The people in the other two cars were Wu Yin people, so they didn't have much of a reaction when they got out of the car. Among them, there was a great master in the Kong state named He Tiangang. After he got out of the car, he went directly to Qin Shi, then respectfully bowed to him and said, "Mr. Chun, you've worked hard." Maybe it was because of their trust in Qin Shi, the Wu Yin only sent one person in the Kong state, and the rest were all in the transforming state. He Tiangang was the one with the highest cultivation level among all the people present, other than Qin Shi. Therefore, he could roughly hear some movements. For example, the movement caused by the avalanche and the roar of the Shiva statue. He Tiangang was a smart person, so he didn't tell everyone what happened outside. When he saw that Qin Shi seemed to have taken care of everything, he immediately ran over to express his gratitude to Qin Shi. Showing his presence in front of an X-level master and flattering him without batting an eyelid was always a good thing. Seeing this, Qin Shi smiled and went back to the car. He Tiangang was still smiling because his cultivation level was low and he didn't understand the specific situation. If he really saw what happened, he probably wouldn't even have the courage to stand in front of Qin Shi. In order to form a glacier, there must be a lot of snow. Therefore, storms were actually very common in the Siachen Glacier. This snowstorm lasted for a long time, and it didn't stop until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The convoy obviously couldn't stay here forever, so they set off again in the snow. In this terrible weather, Unless the Indian soldiers were made of iron, they wouldn't patrol the mountains. The all-terrain vehicle traveled smoothly through the mountains. After 2 hours of driving, Chun Shi and the others finally arrived at their destination, Siachen Pass. Chapter 243. India's mountain combat troops were the army with the most experience in high-altitude and cold areas in the world. From 1984 until now, the Indians had successfully built at least 150 strongholds here. But seriously, this place was more meaningful than practical. The temperature was minus 50 degrees, and it was often accompanied by snowstorms and hailstorms that reached 100 kilometers per hour. If it weren't for the appearance of an oasis, Huaxia obviously wouldn't have sent people here to investigate. Perhaps it was because of the weather, Chun Shi and his team didn't encounter any Indian sentries along the way. After the all-terrain vehicle went over a small mountain, everyone suddenly felt that their vision suddenly widened. This was a huge flat terrain zone. The towering icebergs were like a barrier blocking the wind and snow on the other side of the mountain. If one were to look down from the sky from an airplane, one would find that the terrain of this place was like a gourd. It was composed of 2 oval plains, one big and one small, connected together. The surrounding area was full of rising mountains and precipitous ridges. The waist of the gourd was the so-called Siala mountain pass. The motorcade went over the short mountain and came to the mouth of the gourd. Then, they suddenly stopped not far from the mouth of the gourd, because everyone was shocked by the scene in front of them. People who had never seen a glacier might not be able to imagine what kind of scene it was. The ground was white, the mountains were white, and the sky was white. As far as the eye could see, it was a vast expanse of whiteness. It was an extreme scene of ice and snow. However, in such a pure world of ice and snow, a large oasis appeared out of thin air. First of all, it was unscientific. Secondly, it was unscientific. Finally, it was unscientific. On the side of the Siachen Glacier, snow was everywhere. Although the weather now was much better than in the morning, there was still light snow in the sky. The entire sky was shrouded by dark clouds, and it was a hazy scene. However, inside the mouth of the gourd, there were lush plants and green grass. The dark clouds and snow seemed to be blocked by the towering mountains, so the bright sun shone from the sky and illuminated the entire valley. The driver was a little unsure of the situation. For the sake of insurance, he stopped the car outside the valley. After the 4 professors in the car saw the scene in front of them, they immediately walked out of the car and carefully observed the surrounding situation. It was still snowing outside the valley, but inside the valley, the sun was shining brightly. From a scientific point of view, this situation could be explained with a convincing explanation. But what was the situation with the plants inside? Not only was it winter, but they were also in the highlands that were more than 6,000 meters above sea level. The climate was comparable to that of the Antarctic. Even if there were plants in such places, they were of the lower order, such as mosses or ferns. The seemingly inconspicuous grass by the roadside was actually a high-grade plant, so it was absolutely impossible for it to appear in such an extremely cold area. Professor E shuddered and hugged his jacket tighter before squatting down to dig at the snow. He wanted to check the temperature of the soil here. However, after digging at least half a meter deep and not seeing any soil, he wisely gave up on this idea. This place was full of pine snow. Even if he continued to dig, he would probably only be able to dig out a glacier that had not melted for 10,000 years. While the professors were studying the differences between the inside and outside of the valley, He Tiangang stealthily led the Wu Yin people into the gourd with Chun Shi's permission. He Tiangang did not see any Indian soldiers along the way, so he assumed the Indians were hiding in the oasis. Therefore, he wanted to sneak in to take a look. However, when He Tiangang stealthily approached the mouth of the gourd, he was shocked to discover that there were no Indian soldiers in the valley. In fact, there were not even any living creatures in the valley. There seemed to be an invisible dividing line at the mouth of the valley. The moment He Tiangang crossed it, the surrounding temperature shot up abruptly. It was as though he had suddenly arrived in Sanya from the northeast. In fact, it was even more exaggerated than that. The temperature difference soared to more than 70 degrees Celsius. The Wu Yin people immediately dispersed and went deeper into the oasis to investigate the situation. At this time, Qinshi also slowly crossed the dividing line. However, the moment he crossed the dividing line, he couldn't help but take a deep breath. The spirit energy here was so dense. It was comparable to Tianxian. Was this the phenomenon brought about by the revival of spirit energy? Qinshi stood at the mouth of the gourd and raised his head slightly to look at the blue sky above the valley. This place was actually a natural spirit gathering formation. Every mountain and even every boulder in the surrounding area occupied the key positions needed to set up the formation. Was all of this man-made, or was it the will of the heavens? She frowned slightly. After standing at the mouth of the gourd and sensing for a while, he waved his sleeves and concealed his figure. Then he suddenly flew into the sky above the valley. He looked down at the entire oasis from the sky. Everything in the oasis was in his eyes. Apart from their group, there was no one else in the huge oasis. Since there were cultivators stopping them from entering the mountain, it meant that India knew about the existence of this place and had sent people to guard it to the death. Then, where were the Indians? Perhaps because the oasis had just appeared, the trees in the valley were not flourishing. Apart from the lush green grass, there were only a few scattered trees and shrubs. When he first saw this valley of green grass, it gave him a breathtaking feeling. However, after looking at it for a long time, this valley gave him a very strange feeling. The sun was shining brightly, the vegetation was lush, and it was as peaceful and warm as a park in the afternoon. However, it gave him a vague feeling that this place was very deserted, and at the same time, very strange. Qinshi frowned and pondered for a moment. Only then did he realize that it was because there were no sounds of animals or insects in the valley. At the same time, there was no sound of wind. The entire valley was eerily quiet. Qinshi flew in the sky and quietly observed the actions of everyone below. He Tiangang led a team to carefully inspect the oasis. Several professors were busy moving various instruments out of the all-terrain vehicles. Everything seemed normal. Apart from discovering that this was a natural spirit gathering formation, he did not find anything unusual. However, this was why it seemed a little abnormal. She didn't know why, but Qinshi always had a feeling that a storm was coming. However, he could not pinpoint exactly what was wrong. This feeling, Qinshi frowned. After pondering for a while, he suddenly realized that this feeling had already appeared once before. When this feeling first appeared, it was also when he discovered that the Earth's spirit chi had begun to recover. That was a normal human reaction to the unknown. That was why he instinctively felt repulsed. Chapter 244. In such a remote area, logistical supplies could only be transported by helicopter. Therefore, even if the Siala Pass was a strategic military area, the number of soldiers stationed around it generally did not exceed a platoon. A platoon had 3 squads. Each squad had 10 people. Due to the special nature of the mission and the fact that they did not know how important the oasis was to the Indians, Wu Yin sent masters who were at least masters or above. In addition, he invited Qinshi, an EX-level celestial, to lead the team. This was already an indication of how important the oasis was. Once they were discovered by the Indian garrison, the martial artists would be able to restrain them, while the professors would take the opportunity to collect samples and data. There was no problem with the plan. However, to everyone's surprise, there was not a single person in the oasis. Tiangang also felt that something was wrong. Therefore, after he confirmed that the oasis was safe, he still ordered everyone to spread out and be on guard to ensure the smooth progress of the mission. He did not dare to relax for even a moment. The other professors did not have as many concerns as Tiangang. After hearing Tiangang say that it was safe here, they openly set up tents in the oasis. They then moved all kinds of instruments inside and powered up the all-terrain vehicle. It was as if they had set up a temporary laboratory here. Qinshi did not find anything strange. After pondering for a while, he decided to just cultivate here. After all, It was a sacred place for cultivation. He could not just let it go to waste. In the blink of an eye, it was 6 o'clock in the evening. Dinner was very simple. It was Huaxia Army's individual rations. Just when everyone was taking turns to eat, Chun-Shi suddenly found He Tian-gang and handed him a stone. The stone was the most common stone, but Chun-Shi cast a spell on it. If anything happened, He Tian-gang only needed to throw the stone on the ground, and he would know immediately no matter where he was. As for where he was going, was there a need? Of course, he was going home after work. He had been separated from the little guy for a whole day. Chun-Shi really missed the cute little guy. Since he did not find anything strange, he did not need to stay here all the time. After all, compared to cultivation, Chun-Shi preferred to be with the clingy little guy. He Tian-gang was different from the straightforwardly Tai-Dan. He knew Chun-Shi's strength very well, so he did not dare to ask too much. Therefore, after taking the stone from Chun-Shi, He Tian-gang carefully put it in his pocket. Not to mention a stone, even if Chun-Shi gave him a pile of shit, He Tian-gang would still put it away properly. In order to prevent Li Tai-Dan from worrying, Chun-Shi specifically went to greet him before she left, saying that she was going out with He Tian-gang for a walk. Only then did Li Tai-Dan feel relieved. Then, Chun-Shi flew into the sky. However, before he left, he still glanced at the oasis below with some concern. After confirming that there were no problems, Chun-Shi flew back to Rong City without looking back. When Chun-Shi returned to Aunt Zhang's house, the family was happily sitting on the sofa and watching cartoons with the little guy. Chun-Shi gently knocked on the door. Although the sound was soft, it immediately attracted the little guy's attention. Then, she suddenly bounced up from the sofa as if she had been electrocuted. Before Aunt Zhang could react, the little guy had jumped off the sofa and ran quickly to the door. As she ran, she shouted loudly, "Papa is back! Papa is back!" Chun-Shi heard his daughter's sweet voice through the iron door. He could not help but smile. Time seemed to return to the time in Kongju District. At that time, didn't the little guy look forward to him coming home from work every day? Home is a warm harbor. Come back to rest when you are tired. It was a simple sentence, but at this time, it resonated deeply with the people in the room. The old-fashioned iron door was quickly opened. The little guy followed her grandmother's instructions and opened the door only a crack. She tilted her little head and looked outside with one eye. After confirming that it was indeed Chun-Shi standing outside, she suddenly opened the iron door and rushed directly to Chun-Shi. "Papa!" Seeing the little guy rushing to him, Chun-Shi quickly squatted down and held her in his arms. After kissing the little guy's smooth little face, Chun-Shi asked with a smile, "Nian, do you miss Papa?" Hearing this, the little guy suddenly grinned and said, "Yes. Good girl. Muan." After Chun-Shi walked into the house with the little guy in his arms, Aunt Zhang immediately stood up and asked with a smile, "Have you eaten? There are still some dishes. I'll heat them up for you." While speaking, Aunt Zhang was about to go to the kitchen. Seeing this, Chun-Shi immediately stopped her and said with a smile, "No, I've eaten outside. Okay, sit down. I'll get you a glass of water. I can do it myself. How can that be?" Aunt Zhang smiled and patted Chun-Shi's hand away, then went into the kitchen to get him some water. Chun-Shi could only smile helplessly since her objection was futile. Auntie Zhang was still treating him as a guest. When Chun-Shi sat next to her with the little guy in his arms, Qin Ruoying asked with a little concern, "Are you okay?" "Of course not. You know how powerful your husband is. Look at you." Seeing his relaxed face, Qin Ruoying was relieved and did not ask any more questions. While Chun-Shi was talking to her, she placed the little guy between the two of them. Seeing this, the little fellow immediately stretched out her two little hands happily. She held Papa on the left and Mama on the right, and then naughtily pulled them to her side. On the big sofa, the family of three was tightly squeezed together. When Aunt Zhang came out of the kitchen with cold water and saw this scene, she could not help smiling. After waiting for so many years, she finally saw their family reunion. The little thing was curled up between the couple. When it saw its grandmother come out, it immediately stretched out its body and lay on Qin Ruoying's body. It patted the sofa next to it and shouted, "Grandma, come and sit too." "Okay, Grandma, sit down." Aunt Zhang handed the cup to Chun Shi and touched his little head lovingly. Then she sat next to Qin Ruoying. Then the little thing jumped off the sofa. After taking a serious look at each of her relatives in front of her, she introduced them one by one to the air, as if she was practicing to introduce her relatives to strangers. This is my papa. This is my mama. This is my grandma. In fact, this was a child's mentality to show off. Of course, she couldn't help showing off now that she had everything she didn't have before. Her childish and naive behavior amused everyone so much that they couldn't help but shake their heads and burst out laughing. Chapter 245. The whole family happily sat on the sofa and watched cartoons. The little fellow watched TV while holding Chun Shi's mobile phone. Although the cartoons were very interesting, she still looked down at the phone from time to time and then grinned. And the thing that made her so happy was actually just a photo. It was a family photo consisting of her, Papa, Mama, and Grandma. The only thing that made the little fellow feel a little regretful was the big cat was not in the family photo. Although the little fellow had the twin brothers as good friends, the big cat was her first real companion, so she naturally would not forget the big cat. But unfortunately, the big cat did not come to Chengdu with them. The big cat seemed to retain some of its animal nature, so it was not willing to exercise in winter and stayed at home all day. When they set off from Shangjing, Chunshi did not force the big cat to accompany them, but very kindly asked if it would like to go back to Chengdu with them to play. The big cat was also a little tempted, but when it heard that it was going to take a plane, it was suddenly scared and jumped to the beam, then shook its head like a rattle drum and decisively refused Chunshi's proposal. It could be seen how much it hated to take a plane. It was night. After the little fellow fell asleep, Chunshi gently turned over from her and then quietly lay side by side with Qin Ruoying. Qin Ruoying also seemed to enjoy this feeling, so for the first time, she did not cultivate tonight. In the dark, the couple's fingers were clasped, and their hands were connected, silently feeling each other's existence. At this moment, they were happy. However, at this dull and sweet moment of happiness, Chunshi suddenly frowned. Because the stone was activated by He Tiangang, Qin Ruoying was now a successful cultivator, so she immediately noticed the abnormality from Chunshi's hand. So, she quickly turned her head and whispered in the dark, "What's wrong? There's a problem. The thing that Second Aunt asked you to help with." "Yes." "Then go quickly. Be careful. We'll wait for you at home." "All right, don't worry. I'll be back once the matter is settled." Chunshi first squeezed her hand, then leaned over and gently left a kiss on her lips. Only then did he reluctantly get off the bed. After all, He Tiangang was a great grandmaster in Gang State. It was impossible for him to joke with Chunshi about this kind of thing. Something must have happened for him to activate the stone that Chunshi had given him. Thinking of this, Chunshi couldn't help but quicken his steps. But before he left, he didn't forget to go to the little fellow's side. He bent down and pecked the little fellow's cute little face before he left the house with a frown. As soon as he walked out of the building, Chunshi soared into the sky and flew directly in the direction of the Karakoram mountain range. The moon was very bright tonight. Perhaps because of the high altitude, the moon in the Karakoram mountain range looked significantly bigger than the moon in Chengdu. The cold moonlight shone on the undulating ice mountains as if it was draped with a thin layer of silver yarn. When Chunshi crossed the Karakoram mountain range and arrived at the Saikin Glacier, he saw that the Saikin mountain pass seemed to be completely covered by a mass of dark clouds from afar. The dark clouds were very thick, like a lid, covering the entire Saikin mountain pass so tightly that he couldn't see the situation below at all. Seeing this, Chunshi couldn't help but frown slightly. This scene was a bit strange, no matter how he looked at it. But looking at the fluctuation of spiritual energy in the surroundings, it didn't seem to be caused by humans. This was a bit strange. Chunshi flew above the dark clouds. After looking down for a while, he suddenly snapped his fingers. Then, a ball of light suddenly jumped out of his fingertip. The light ball was very weak at first, but it emitted a faint glow. But as Chunshi threw the light ball downwards, the light ball became brighter and brighter. Finally, the light ball was like a magnesium lamp, bursting with extremely dazzling light. The light ball quickly floated above the dark clouds. The dark clouds themselves were colorless. Many people thought the dark clouds were black because the water vapor in them was too heavy, which greatly affected the light. In addition, the clouds were too thick and completely blocked the light, so people thought the dark clouds were black. After the light ball went into the dark clouds, the light suddenly became a bit hazy. It was like driving on the highway in a fog. Even if the lights were on, one could only see a few meters away. The clouds were very thick. As the light ball went deeper and deeper, it finally completely lost its light. Chun-Shi flew in the sky and watched the light ball gradually being swallowed by the dark clouds. He couldn't help but let out a cold snort, then plunged into the dark clouds. He wanted to see what was going on inside. Chun-Shi was very fast. In the blink of an eye, he reached the ground. But when he reached the ground, he realized that the entire Ciala Pass was filled with dark clouds. The visibility was less than 1 meter. It was clouds in the sky, but on the ground, it could only be called fog. The thick fog covered everything. At the same time, the oasis was just like during the day. There was no sound around. Silence, eerie. If Chun-Shi was a normal person, he would probably faint from the scene in front of him. After all, who knew if a ghost face would suddenly appear in the thick fog, or if an arm would reach out? Chun-Shi snapped his fingers again. This time, 4 light balls appeared at the same time. The 4 light balls burst out with a strong light, which immediately pushed the visibility of the surroundings to more than 5 meters. At this time, Chun-Shi saw the temporary laboratory that the professors built during the day. There was no one in the laboratory. The indicators of the various instruments were not lit up. It seemed like there was no electricity at all. 3 all-terrain vehicles were parked next to the laboratory, and there was no one in the vehicles. A total of more than 20 people just disappeared into thin air. Humph. It seemed like Chun-Shi was bored of this exploration game, and he suddenly let out an angry snort. Then, the Sky Spill Godly Sword appeared next to him. Chun-Shi held the long sword in his hand and slashed at the thick fog in front of him. A crescent-shaped sword aura suddenly burst out, and it created a strong wind that directly slashed at the thick fog in front of him. Since the fog was blocking his vision, he had to clear the fog first. However, what Chun-Shi didn't expect was that after the crescent-shaped sword aura flew for more than 10 meters, it suddenly disappeared into the thick fog. Seeing this, the expression on Chun-Shi's face suddenly became slightly more serious. The sword aura he released was swallowed by the thick fog. The thick fog swallowed his sword aura? Are you kidding? Chapter 246. The fog was like the souls of the dead from the 9 serenities. It was as if it wanted to devour everything. Chun-Shi's crescent-shaped sword aura only flew for about 10 meters before it completely lost its glow in the thick fog. Although it was just a casual swing of his sword and was not an exquisite move, it should not have been so weak. This situation really shocked Chun-Shi and caused him to instantly get into battle mode. But what was out of Chun-Shi's expectations was that he waited in the thick fog for quite a while, but did not discover any danger lurking in the fog. Everything was very calm. It was as if it was just a natural fog. Chun-Shi held the Tian Yin sword in his hand and frowned as he constantly observed the thick fog in front of him. His divine sense was sealed, so he could only rely on his 5 senses to observe the outside world. The fog was so thick that it could not be seen through or blown away. Even if there were light balls in all directions, Chun-Shi could only see within 10 meters at most. This feeling really made him very unhappy. Chun-Shi stood in the thick fog for a long time. After a long while, he seemed to have thought of something, and a thoughtful expression suddenly appeared on his face. Thus, he stretched out his arm and opened his palm. A miniature spirit gathering formation immediately appeared in Chun-Shi's palm. Following the activation of the spirit gathering array, a faint cyclone rose from his palm shakily. The spirit gathering formation was the most basic formation, and its working principle was very simple. After it was successfully set up, it would be like a tornado and constantly revolve around the eye of the formation to absorb the surrounding spiritual energy. Thus, when the spirit-gathering formation appeared, the cyclone condensed and formed at a speed visible to the naked eye. Its color also became darker and darker until it finally became an extremely thick milky white. In less than a minute, Chunshi suddenly felt a cold feeling in his palm. Upon closer inspection, it turned out that a drop of water had suddenly condensed in the center of the cyclone. Seeing this, Chunshi's expression suddenly became one of realization. He finally understood what this thick fog was. Just like how water can be divided into gaseous, liquid, and solid forms, the spiritual chi of heaven and earth can also be divided into several forms. Under normal circumstances, mortals were unable to see the heaven and earth spirit chi. However, if the spiritual chi of heaven and earth was too dense, it would become as hazy as fog. This form of spiritual chi of heaven and earth was also called spiritual fog by immortal cultivators. The mist was in a liquid state, but it was made up of extremely fine water droplets, which was why it could float in the air. In addition, when the spiritual chi of heaven and earth reached a certain level, it would completely change from a gaseous state to a liquid state, which was the so-called spiritual liquid. Spirit liquid was extremely rare. Chunshi had only seen it a few times in Heavenly Spiral. As for the solid spiritual chi of heaven and earth, which was the legendary spiritual crystal, he had only heard of it but never seen it before. It completely existed in legends. The reason why Chunshi didn't immediately recognize that it was a spiritual mist was because the spiritual energy of heaven and earth in this form had already become a whole. Just like a balloon filled with water, every drop of the spiritual mist contained surging spiritual chi of heaven and earth. This spiritual chi would not leak out, so only by piercing the balloon could one feel the energy contained within. It turned out that the entire sky above this huge oasis was actually filled with spiritual mist. This was a little interesting. Chunshi withdrew the celestial sword Dharma idol and then activated the technique. At that moment, his entire body seemed to have turned into a human-shaped black hole, and he began to madly devour the spiritual mist around him. However, now was obviously not the time to cultivate, so he could only devour the spiritual mist as he silently walked into the depths of the oasis. At that moment, a thought suddenly appeared in Chunshi's mind. The mysterious village hidden in the depths of the Qinling Mountains, after hundreds of years of accumulation by the Great Spirit Binding Array, only caused a spiritual chi tide that lasted less than 15 minutes. The spiritual chi tide successfully opened a crack in the sky and created the existence of the heavenly generals, who were completely beyond the current realm on Earth. If the elders waited until the spiritual chi revival to open the array, would they be able to directly open the divine gate? Thinking of this, Chunshi could not help but raise his eyebrows. He could not help but be curious about what was behind the divine gate. What level of existence would the heavenly generals be considered in the divine gate? Chunshi's thoughts drifted further and further away. At this moment, something that suddenly appeared in front of him pulled him back from his thoughts abruptly. A tree appeared in front of Chunshi. A huge tree. Because the visibility was too low, Chunshi could only walk around the tree. This turn was incredible. The diameter of this tree was more than 20 meters, which meant that the circumference of this tree was at least 70 to 80 meters. If he remembered correctly, this place during the day, other than the green grass, there were only some trees and shrub seedlings. Only a few hours had passed. How could such a huge tree appear out of nowhere? How could Chunshi not be surprised? Although Chunshi could also make the green mountains bloom with red makeup and make the thousands of maple leaves bloom with magic. However, he definitely could not make a seedling turn into a 1,000-year-old ancient tree in an instant. The diameter of this tree was more than 20 meters, and he did not know how tall this tree was. Chunshi stood under the tree and looked up, but the thick spirit fog completely blocked his vision, so he could not see the situation above the tree trunk at all. Seeing this, Chunshi thought about it and took a step forward, wanting to touch the bark of this tree. However, the moment his palm touched the tree bark, something unexpected happened. A formless energy suddenly surged in from all directions like a hurricane, formless but extraordinarily powerful. Chunxi's reaction was also very fast. The Tian sword appeared in his hand almost instantly, followed by a clang sound. He originally thought that there was an enemy attack, but when Chunxi turned around with the sword in his hand, he realized that there was a new change in the spirit fog behind him. Just like how Moses parted the sea in the legends, the spiritual fog that was so thick that even he couldn't disperse seemed to be pushed to the sides by two invisible glass walls, so much so that a passage appeared in front of him out of thin air. The passage was pitch black. Seeing this, Chunxi immediately flicked his finger. A ball of light suddenly flew into the depths of the dark passage. The passage was not very long, and the ball of light quickly flew to the end. At this time, Chunxi also saw the thing at the end of the passage. It was a huge stone tablet. It was not right to call it a stone tablet because this stone tablet was shining brightly under the light of the ball of light, constantly reflecting the unique luster of metal. The stone tablet was very big, at least 10 meters tall and 2 to 3 meters wide. On the surface of the tablet, there was a line of ancient characters, which read, Chapter 247. Chunxi looked at the stone tablet at the end of the tunnel, then turned back to look at the giant tree behind him. At this moment, he could not help but shake his head and laugh. Spiritual Qi revival, heaven and earth phenomenon? This was getting more and more interesting. Perhaps it was because of his boldness. Chunxi did not think too much. He held the Tian sword and walked into the tunnel that suddenly appeared. Just like the spiritual fog that filled the sky, the tree and the stone tablet were strange existences that suddenly appeared tonight. Thus, everything in front of him was either an illusion or a large-scale formation. With Chunxi's current cultivation, an illusion that could affect his mind would at least require a cultivator of the insightful emptiness realm to cast. But what kind of existence was the insightful emptiness realm? With Earth's current conditions, it was obviously impossible to give birth to a cultivator of the divine transformation realm. After eliminating the illusion, there was only one possibility left. This was a large-scale formation that stole the fortune of heaven and earth. A large-scale formation that used the spiritual fog as the foundation, the tree as the formation door, and the stone tablet as the formation core. When the spiritual fog appeared, the formation would be activated. Because Chunxi touched the tree, he was pulled into the formation. There were many uses for formations, but looking at the current situation, the formation in front of him should not be a support formation like the spirit gathering formation. It was very likely to be a killing formation, a formation whose main purpose was to kill. Since he was already in the formation, he had to find a formation core if he wanted to break the formation. Chunxi quickly came to the side of the stone tablet. After carefully looking at the stone tablet, he realized that other than the words, exorcise evil and seal demons on the front, the back of the stone tablet also had the words human desires, heaven's wrath prison. Seeing this, Chunxi held the Tian sword and gently slashed at the stone tablet. As expected, when the tip of the sword touched the stone tablet, it was like a stone falling into a calm water surface. The place where the tip of the sword touched actually had a slight ripple. This huge stone tablet was actually an illusion that was similar to a mirage. Since the stone tablet was just an illusion, Chunxi didn't want to stay any longer. He picked up his sword and walked towards the back of the stone tablet. As if he was strolling in his own backyard, Chunxi leisurely strolled through the thick fog. There was originally a thick fog behind the stone tablet, but as Chunxi continued to go deeper, the fog in front of him became thinner and thinner. In the end, a faint light shone out from the fog. When Chunxi finally walked out of the fog, in an instant, golden light filled the sky. Just like the rising sun, thousands of golden rays of light shot from the front and shone directly on Chunxi's body. Chunxi looked forward against the golden light and realized that he was in a strange place. This was a huge square, but it was not empty at all. Instead, it was piled with countless treasures. Just like in The Hobbit, where the dragon Smaug occupied the lonely mountain treasury, countless gold, silver, and jewels were randomly piled up in the square. It was a dazzling array. It was so dazzling that it almost blinded people's eyes. It was estimated that the current gold and silver reserves in the world couldn't form such a huge scale. If such a treasury was discovered by outsiders, who knew what kind of uproar it would cause? In the 18th century, California in the United States was originally a very remote and backward place. However, after the news of the discovery of gold in California spread, the entire United States and even the world was shocked. Thousands of gold miners flocked to California. The population boom led to the emergence of several international metropolises in California, such as Hollywood and Los Angeles. As a result, California went from a small and remote place to one of the top administrative regions in the United States. From this, it could be seen how tempting gold, silver, and jewels were to humans. If the news of the treasury was leaked, Huaxia would probably start a war with the Indians tomorrow. Ordinary people scrambled for gold, silver, and jewels, but to Qin Shi, this treasury was obviously not as valuable as a drop of spirit fog. Therefore, even if there was a mountain of gold and a sea of silver in front of him, he didn't even look at it. He stood at the entrance and looked around. The treasury was very quiet. There was no one and no strange movements. Other than the countless gold, silver, and jewels, there was only a winding stone path in this huge square. The stone path crossed the entire square, and at the end was a large expanse of thick fog. Seeing this, Chun-Shi didn't delay any longer and walked directly into the depths of the square along the path. Both sides of the path were piled with priceless gold, silver, and jewels. He only needed to bend down slightly, and Chun-Shi could pick up a palm-sized gold brick from the ground. However, he still didn't look at it and walked on the path without looking sideways. Soon, Chun-Shi came to the end of the path. The thick fog engulfed him again. The moment Chun-Shi walked into the fog, the square suddenly changed. The countless mountains of gold and silver suddenly turned into a scalp-numbing sea of corpses and blood. How was this a treasury? It was simply hell. Countless corpses were piled up randomly. The mountains of gold became mountains of limbs, and the sea of silver became lakes of blood. If one looked closely, one could see many soldiers wearing Indian military uniforms. It was no wonder that when Chun-Shi and his group arrived at the oasis, they didn't see a single Indian soldier. They must have been wiped out in this strange place. Chun-Shi continued to walk in the thick fog. By the time the fog had thinned out and the light had returned, he had arrived in a new place. It was a new square. However, the square was no longer piled with gold, silver, and jewels. Instead, it was filled with countless large icicles that looked like clusters of crystals. Similarly, there was still a stone path winding through the square. Chun-Shi continued to walk along the path. When he passed by the icicles, he suddenly realized that there was a woman sealed in each icicle. Countless devastatingly beautiful women were all stark naked without a stitch of clothing on. Although these women were sealed in the icicles, their expressions and postures were extremely seductive and lustful. Just looking at them a few more times could make one's heart burn with lust. With Chun-Shi's appearance, the women in the icicles seemed to have come alive. They lay in the icicles and kept changing all kinds of seductive postures. They even faintly let out a series of extremely erotic moans. For a moment, the square was filled with erotic scenes. Such a scene made Chun-Shi frown uncontrollably. He now had a rough idea of what this formation was all about. The formation in front of him was different from traditional killing formations. Although it was also offensive, it wouldn't take the initiative to attack. Instead, it would set up all kinds of traps to lure people into it. Once the person who entered the formation couldn't resist and touch the traps, death would await them. However, with this level of temptation, let alone immortal cultivators, even martial artists with slightly higher cultivation wouldn't be able to tempt them. It was too easy. Therefore, Chun-Shi didn't stop at all. He directly passed through the square and entered the fog again. As he continued to move forward, Chun Shi's frown deepened. He really didn't understand now. No matter what, this was a large-scale formation that used spirit fog as its base. Was this all it could do? Chapter 248. Chun Shi walked through the fog. When the fog in front of him thinned again, he came to the third square. Slightly different from the previous two squares, the third square was covered with lush vegetation. As soon as he stepped into it, he felt as if he was in a primitive forest. However, there were no signs of any living creatures in this primitive forest. Although he was not close to the square, a strong herbal fragrance went straight to the tip of Chun Shi's nose. As far as the eye could see, this place was simply like a paradise. Money and beautiful women. Is it time for spiritual herbs and rare treasures? Chun Shi thoughtfully glanced at the rare fruits, lingji, and immortal herbs on the square, but her feet still didn't stop for a moment. He seemed to be strolling slowly, but in fact he used the means of shrinking the ground. In a few steps, he crossed the entire square and then disappeared into the thick fog again. Among the five elements, metal, wood, and water had appeared. If nothing unexpected happened, the next should be the fire array or the earth array. As expected, when Chun Shi came to the fourth square, he suddenly felt a wave of heat hit him in the face. Countless huge copper pillars were erected in the huge square. Below the pillars, a raging fire was burning. It looked somewhat similar to the tortures of the ancient times. If the metal array and the water array were only targeted at ordinary people, then the wood and fire arrays have begun to target cultivators, especially the fire array. When Chun Shi stepped into the fire array, the heat in the air faintly raised an inexplicable irritation in his heart. At this time, Chun Shi found that this array was not as simple as it looked on the surface. In fact, if this array had not been affecting the mind of the person who entered the array, there were probably not many muddle-headed people who would easily touch the trap in such a strange place. After all, how could gold, silver, jewels, and beautiful women be more important than their own lives? The stranger the environment, the more cautious people should be. Chun Shi thought silently as he walked through the fire array and into the thick fog again. There was only one earth array left. However, when the fog in front of him thinned again, what appeared in front of Chun Shi was no longer the square, but a very familiar place. His and Yingying's home, Zhonghai, Kongju District. Although Chun Shi had lived in the side courtyard for a period of time, the home that he truly recognized in his heart was still this slightly shabby demolition community. Looking at the familiar scene before him, even Chun Shi couldn't help but be stunned. The furnishings in the room were the same as before. Old furniture, picture albums scattered all over the place, and everything else. It was all so real. Just as Chun Shi was lost in thought, a clear and melodious papa came from behind him. Papa. Chun Shi looked back and saw Nian standing behind him. She was holding a picture book and seemed to want to hand it to him. Papa, tell a story. Nian raised her small hand with great effort, as if she wanted to stuff the album into Chun Shi's hands. Chun Shi lowered his head and looked at Nian's cute, smiling face and expectant eyes. At this moment, he was strangely enraged. Because he was so angry, it even caused the veins on his forehead to bulge. A dragon has a reverse scale, and a wolf has a thorn. Kill if you look at it, kill if you touch it. This array dared to touch the softest part of his heart, and tried to conjure a little girl to deceive him. Damn it! Kill, kill, kill. In a fit of rage, Chun Shi slapped the picture book in Nian's hand. Then, he let out a roar and said, Sword come. He hadn't been so angry in a long time. Daring to have ideas about Nian, kill without mercy. Chun Shi suddenly stretched out his right hand and made a grabbing motion in the air. But that familiar feeling didn't appear. Because the sword didn't come. The sky-spilled divine sword didn't appear. Chun Shi couldn't help but look at his right hand in surprise. Then, he activated the spell and tried to use his true essence to condense the divine sword dharma again. But at this moment, a familiar voice suddenly sounded. Chun Shi, what are you doing? Are you crazy? You're scaring her. With a shout, Qin Ruoying, who was wearing an apron, rushed out of the kitchen and hugged Nian Yin in a panic. She comforted her in a low voice. Nian Yin was obviously frightened by Chun Shi's reaction. After Qin Ing hugged her, she suddenly pouted her little mouth and cried out loud. Wah! Nian Yin, don't cry. Mommy is here. Don't cry, don't cry. Qin Ing squatted on the ground and hugged Nian Yin tightly in her arms. While comforting the child, she raised her head and glared fiercely at Qin Shi. Then, she shouted angrily, Are you crazy? Look clearly. She is Nian Yin. She is your daughter. Qin Ing roared at Chun Shi. Then she seemed to think of something. She couldn't help muttering in a panic. No, your illness is getting worse and worse. Nian Yin, Dad is sick again. Let's go get the medicine for Dad. Hearing this, Nian Yin seemed to be frightened. After looking back at Chun Shi with red eyes, Nian Yin sniffed and tried to stop crying. Looking at his wife and daughter in panic, Chun Shi couldn't help but let out a low roar. Fuck! This array formation had actually affected his mind. Chun Shi originally came in with the mentality of playing, but he didn't expect that even he would be lost in this array. Thinking of this, Chun Shi couldn't help but show a dignified expression on his face. Then, he suddenly put his palms together and made a gesture with a solemn expression. 49 Styles of Tianyu, Spell Section, 10th Manifestation, Break Illusion. It specializes in breaking all illusions and illusions in the world. However, at this moment, Chun Shi seemed to have completely lost his cultivation, and there was no trace of true spirit surging all over his body. He tried to use break illusion, but everything was still the same. And Qin Ing, after seeing Chun Shi's behavior, seemed to be frightened by something. He picked up Nian Yin, then rushed into the bedroom. Looking at Qin Ing's frightened look, Chun Shi's brows were frowning more and more. Break illusion failed. It seemed that his consciousness had been completely lost in this array. He thought that this was just a simple killing array, but he didn't expect it to be a composite array of killing, illusion, trapping, and disturbance. His current situation was somewhat similar to the state of his soul leaving his body. His physical body was still in place, but his consciousness was trapped in the illusion built by the array. Therefore, in this situation, he couldn't be anxious and could only slowly think of a way to break the array. Illusion arrays could also kill people, and the principle was similar to the triple dream realm in the Inception space, causing the consciousness of the person who entered the array to be trapped in the illusion and never be able to wake up. To break the illusion, it wasn't easy, but it was actually very simple. It was easy, but it was actually very difficult. This was because it had nothing to do with cultivation. It was all about one's willpower. Don't forget your original intention. These 4 words were the divine weapon to break all illusions in the world. Thinking of this, Chun Shi immediately sat cross-legged, held his breath, and tried to find a way to wake himself up. And not long after he sat cross-legged. Chapter 249. Qin Ing took out a few pills and tried to stuff them into Chun Shi's mouth. This was haloperidol, a very common antipsychotic drug. It was mainly used to fight hallucinations and delusions. It had a certain sedative effect, and, at the same time, it was also toxic. Chun Shi sat cross-legged in the living room like a stone Buddha. No matter how Qin Ing tried to persuade him, he had no intention of opening his mouth. Nian Yin was lying in the corridor outside the bedroom. She tilted her head and only revealed a pair of eyes. She silently looked at her parents in the living room. Perhaps it was because he had just cried, but the little guy's eyes were red, giving him a pitiful look. Nian Yin and Ing, these were the 2 most important people in Chun Shi's life. At the same time, they were also Chun Shi's weakness. In the Tianxian world, most cultivators were far more afraid of illusion arrays than killing arrays. Once one entered a killing array, there was only a slim chance of survival. Although illusion arrays did not kill people, they were more frightening than killing arrays. This was because illusion arrays could make people lose themselves and willingly sink into the beautiful illusion carefully woven by illusion arrays. Until the person's physical body died and their soul dissipated, There was no way to wake up. Zhuang Zhou dreaming of a butterfly? Or a butterfly dreaming of Zhuang Zhou? She look at me, I'm inging. Be obedient, okay? Take the medicine obediently, okay? Look at Yin Yin, you scared her. Don't be like this, okay? We were very worried about you. Qin Ruoying's slightly worried voice kept ringing in Chunxi's ears. But Chunxi sat on the ground motionlessly, as if he did not hear anything. Seeing this, Qin Ruoying's face couldn't help but darken. Bean-sized tears suddenly gushed out from her eyes. Life will always experience twists and turns. If the company closes down, then so be it. Don't give yourself so much pressure, be strong. No matter what you do, I will support you. But don't give up like this, okay? I'm so scared. Qin Ruoying kept talking in Chunxi's ear. Chunxi did not have the ability to seal his hearing. Therefore, no matter how hard he tried to enter a meditative state, Qin Ruoying's words still drilled into his ears without missing a single word. From Qin Ruoying's words, Chunxi also passively understood his current situation. After he graduated from university, he started a family with Qin Ruoying. Later on, he had Yin Yin. As the family expenses increased, he left the company to start his own business. Dreams were always beautiful. Because of his lack of experience, the company went bankrupt. Chunxi was also deeply affected by this and even suffered from depression. In the following days, Chunxi didn't work anymore. Instead, he stayed at home every day. His condition also became more and more serious. At first, it was just insomnia. Later on, he actually developed schizophrenia. From time to time, he would go crazy like today and fantasize that he was a god more powerful than Superman. It was not the first time that Qin Ruoying saw Chunxi behave like this. Therefore, she hugged Chunxi tightly and kept whispering in his ear. Chunxi was unwilling to open his mouth, so Qin Ruoying kept trying to open Chunxi's mouth and feed him the pill. There was no doubt that this kind of care came from the heart. However, Chunxi was completely unmoved. He was always looking for a way to wake himself up. Only people who experienced the horror of the illusion array knew. Every cultivator who came out of the illusion array alive was a person with a firm mind. If even he began to doubt himself, he would only sink deeper and deeper into the illusion. Once Chunxi showed a trace of wavering and began to think about whether everything in front of him was real or not, it actually meant that he had already fallen. Don't forget your original intention. Remember, everything in front of him was illusory. No matter what he saw or heard, it was all fake. In fact, there was a simple and crude way to break the illusion array. That was kill Qin Ruoying in front of him. Since the illusion array confused him with his wife and daughter, the key to breaking the array was obviously Qin Ruoying and Yin Yin. Unfortunately, even if Chunxi knew that it was an illusion, he was not willing to hurt Ying and Yin Yin in the illusion. This was probably the difference between him and many cultivators. No matter what Qin Ruoying said, Chunxi was unmoved. After a long time, Chunxi finally entered the state of meditative anatta. At this time, Qin Ruoying, who was next to him, suddenly showed a trace of fear on her face. She began to shake Chunxi and cried, "Are you leaving us? Don't go. Don't go, please. Papa, don't leave me behind. I don't want you to go." Yin Yin also ran out of the bedroom. The mother and daughter squeezed next to him, crying and begging him to stay. At this moment, Chunxi was like a scumbag who abandoned his wife and daughter. He completely ignored his wife and daughter's cries. As his five senses became more and more blurred, Qin Ruoying and Yin Yin's voices also became farther and farther away from him. The next moment, Chunxi suddenly opened his eyes and found that he was sitting cross-legged in an empty square. There was nothing above the square. Even the small path was gone. There was a thick fog in all directions. The illusion array was finally broken. Chunxi sighed softly. With a grab, the heavenly derivation sword appeared in his hand. The familiar feeling came back again. Chunxi stood up, but the expression on his face was still very serious. This array, it was really scary. Chunxi frowned and seriously looked at the illusion around him. The current him did not dare to underestimate this array anymore. Just as Chun-Shi was observing his surroundings, a crisp sound of a slap suddenly rang out from behind him. Slap, slap, slap. No more, no less, just 3 slaps. Chun-Shi looked back. When he saw the face of the person, Chun-Shi was suddenly stunned. Because a person who absolutely could not appear here had now appeared in front of Chun-Shi. This was a woman. A woman described in the Luo Shun Fu, like a light cloud covering the moon, floating like the returning snow in the wind. Looking from afar, like the sun rising in the morning. Looking closely, like a lotus blooming out of the water. The woman was wearing a blue dress, and her hair was tied up in a cloud bun, but she did not wear any makeup or jewelry. Her eyebrows were dark, like the distant mountains in the fog. Her eyes were blurred, like the warm spring river. That incomparably exquisite oval face was faintly tinged with pink, which was extremely alluring. Ying stood up, as if she wanted to steal the bright light of heaven and earth. The woman walked out of the fog and walked towards Chun-Shi. Seeing this, Chun-Shi suddenly closed his eyes. When he opened his eyes again, the woman was even closer to him. When the woman was about 2 meters away from Chun-Shi, she finally stopped. At this moment, Chun-Shi called out her name with a complicated expression. Zijin. The person who came was goddess Zijin. Chapter 250. Sky and Divine Sect. Yu Zijin. Someone who should not have appeared in front of Chun-Shi had suddenly appeared in front of him. Yu Zijin had a faint smile on her face. But if one looked closely, there seemed to be a hint of playfulness hidden in that smile. After sizing up Chun-Shi, Yu Zijin said softly, Chun-Shi, long time no see. Long time no see. Suddenly seeing an old acquaintance here made Chun-Shi a little confused. After replying dryly, Chun-Shi did not know what to say. After a long while, he then asked with a complicated expression, Zijin, why are you here? Hearing this, Yu Zijin looked at him deeply, then asked, why don't you make a guess? Chun-Shi did not reply immediately, because his feelings were very complicated. Take a guess. These 2 words were what he used to say to Yu Zijin. Heavenly Spiral did not have as rich a cultural and entertainment life as Earth, so when he was free, Chun-Shi would hum a few pop songs for Yu Zijin. And every time Yu Zijin asked where he learned it from, Chun-Shi would always reply with the words, take a guess. But wasn't the teleportation array destroyed? How did Zijin come to Earth? Chun-Shi frowned as he tried to think of an answer. Yu Zijin was not in a hurry, and just looked at him with a smile, as if she wanted him to come up with an answer himself. If he really had to make an analogy, Chun-Shi's current feelings were like when he was out shopping and suddenly saw a good friend who had died many years ago. That kind of feeling really made people feel a little complicated. If he had to use a word to describe the relationship between Chun-Shi and Yu Zijin, then the word beauty was naturally the most appropriate. Beauty. It was known as the 4th type of relationship, dissociating from family, friendship, and love. It was the highest level of interaction between friends of the opposite sex, and also the most dangerous stage. This type of relationship was more dangerous, and if one was not careful, they would cross the red line. The result was either a lifetime or a stranger. After hundreds of years together, it would be a lie to say that they had no feelings for each other. Fortunately, the obsession in Chun-Shi's heart did not disappear with the passage of time. Qin Ruoying was the other half of his life that he was searching for. Therefore, even though Chun-Shi had lived in Heavenly Spiral for 500 years, when he found out that there was still hope for him to return, he resolutely chose to leave. He wanted to leave the world that didn't belong to him. From then on, they would never meet again, not knowing each other's strengths and weaknesses. Just like Shimurong's poem, Farewell, described it, I quietly retired. Forgive me for not saying goodbye. And in the deepest, deepest corner, trying to hide you. He could hide it from anyone and for any period of time. It was an unreachable distance. Chun-Shi's heart was in a mess. He hadn't felt this way for a long time. He had always been very clear about Yu Zijin's feelings for him. So when he faced Yu Zijin, Chun-Shi's feelings were always a little complicated. He didn't do anything wrong, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt. He felt as if he owed someone something. Chun-Shi was slightly dazed. Yu Zijin didn't disturb him. She just stood in front of him, silently sizing him up. Chun-Shi wanted to open her mouth a few times, but after seeing her familiar eyes, she couldn't help but swallow the greeting that was already on the tip of her tongue. That gaze was very similar to the past. Meeting Yu Zijin was too sudden, so much so that Chun-Shi's mind went blank. At this moment, it was as if he had returned to heavenly spiral in the middle of the night, standing in front of Goddess Zijin, who had once fought side by side with him. Chun-Shi was all too familiar with this scene. Midnight dream? Wait, something didn't seem right. Chun-Shi was suddenly stunned. Then he suddenly raised his eyebrows, and his confused eyes immediately became clear and sharp. This was an illusion. He didn't break the array. Instead, he fell into a deeper layer of illusion. This array had found the deepest crack in his heart, layer by layer. First, it was Qin Ruoying and Yin Yin, who wanted to use his family to restrain him. When he thought that he had succeeded in breaking the formation and relaxed a little, he would then conjure up Yu Zijin and use that to destroy his psychological defenses. No wonder Yu Zijin's reaction was a little strange. That was because although the illusory formation had found the gap in his heart, it was unable to understand more. That was why Yu Zijin was like a wooden person and could only passively receive the information from him and then respond to him with it. Scary, it was really scary. This array was really too strange. It could even dig out the deepest secret in his heart. Perhaps it was because she sensed Chun-Shi's strange behavior. At this moment, Yu Zijin suddenly laughed. Her face revealed a smile as pure as a young girl's. She asked mischievously, "Why? You can't guess? Do you want me to tell you? I can tell you, but you have to beg me. If you beg me, I'll tell you." The current her was very similar to the past. However, Chun-Shi only looked at her expressionlessly. At this moment, his heart was as still as water. The next moment, Chun-Shi, however, raised the Tian-Yin sword in her hand and directly pierced her chest. Yu Zijin lowered her head and looked at the long sword in Chun-Shi's hand. She was in disbelief. In an instant, shock, pain, anger, and grief flashed across her face. Chun-Shi, why did you? Yu Zijin seemed to want to say something, but Chun-Shi calmly pressed the long sword in his hand forward. The long sword pierced through Yu Zijin's body. At this time, Chun-Shi took a step forward and whispered in her ear, "Don't worry. With Zijin's talent, she should be at least at the insightful void stage now. Although you made me very angry, I still have to thank you. After all, you let me see her again, although it was only once." At this point, Chun-Shi suddenly withdrew the long sword in his hand. As a stream of blood splattered, Yu Zijin's body slowly fell to the ground. As she fell, her figure became more and more blurry. Finally, she turned into crystal dust and disappeared in front of Chun-Shi. Everything returned to silence. A broken mirror suddenly appeared where Yu Zijin had been standing. That was the array core. The mirror was broken. This array that could see through one's heart had finally been broken by Chun-Shi. However, although the array was broken, Chun-Shi did not look happy at all. He raised his head and looked at the fog that was still surging above his head. After a long time, Chun-Shi finally let out a deep breath. Looking back at the broken mirror, he murmured in a low voice, "It's too late. I'm sorry." This apology was not for the mirror in front of him, but for Goddess Zijin, who was far away in heavenly spiral. "I'm sorry." Chapter 251. The illusion array was broken by Chun-Shi. Therefore, there was only a broken mirror left in this huge square. Chun-Shi looked around silently, but his expression was a bit more dignified. This place was too strange. The 5 elements of metal, wood, water, fire, and earth had all appeared. So what should I do next? There was no stone path in this square. It seemed that this was the end. Chun-Shi looked around and didn't find anything out of the ordinary. Only then did she set her eyes on the broken mirror on the ground. This mirror was not made of glass. Looking carefully, the material was somewhat similar to crystal. It seemed to be a pure and colorless transparent crystal. And just when Chun-Shi looked down and carefully studied the mirror fragments on the ground, the scattered mirror fragments suddenly had a magical change. Like snow meeting the sun, countless small mirror fragments suddenly began to melt at a speed visible to the naked eye. Even if the snow melted, there had to be a process. But the scene in front of Chun-Shi was like pressing the fast-forward button when watching a video. The melting process became very short. In just a few seconds, the mirror fragments on the ground had turned into a pool of silver water. It looked a bit like tin, chromium, and other metals after melting. Seeing this, Chun-Shi immediately took a few steps back. And just as he stepped back, a strong light suddenly appeared in the pool of silver water. A light curtain suddenly rose from it and reached the sky. Array within an array? Looking at the changes in front of him, Chun-Shi couldn't help but frown. This 5-elements great array was strange enough on its own. Who would have thought that there would be another array within it? The pool of silver water in front of him. It was clearly the entrance to another array formation. After seeing the power of the Earth array, Chun-Shi couldn't help but have a trace of vigilance in his heart. Who was the one who had set up such a marvelous large-scale formation? What was the purpose? With countless questions, Chun-Shi hesitated for a moment, but finally chose to step into the light curtain in front of him. Since he was already here, he might as well figure it out. After walking into the light curtain, Chun-Shi's line of sight was completely blocked by a strong light. However, the strong light disappeared quickly, and when the strong light faded, Chun-Shi found himself in a circular hall. This hall was very large. In terms of scale, it seemed to be larger than the bird's nest. The hall was spacious and grand. The closer to the center of the hall, the higher the dome. And in the center of the hall, there was a huge stone pillar supporting the dome. Because of this, the overall shape of the hall looked somewhat like an umbrella. Standing in the middle of the hall was like standing under a huge umbrella. Chun-Shi had just walked out of the light curtain and didn't have time to carefully examine the surrounding environment when a familiar voice rang in his ears. "Mr. Chun." Chun-Shi looked and saw He Tian-Gang and the others sitting in a corner of the hall. However, the number of people was much smaller. The 4 professors were still there, as were Li Tai-Dan and Xue Shujian. However, there were only a few people left in the Grandmaster Guard sent by Wu Lian. After the remaining 10 or so people saw Chun-Shi appear, their faces immediately showed extremely excited expressions. "What are you guys doing?" Chun-Shi came in front of them and could not help but frown. Take He Tian-Gang, who had the highest martial cultivation, for example. He Tian-Gang did not look like a great grandmaster in the gang state. His beard was unkempt, his face was dirty, and his body was constantly emitting a foul smell. It looked like he had not bathed for a long time. His current appearance was somewhat similar to a homeless person on the street. Seeing Chun-Shi's puzzled look, the excitement on He Tian-Gang's face slowly disappeared. After that, a look of self-blame and regret appeared on his face. He could not help but sigh. "Mr. Chun, it's all my fault. I shouldn't have thrown away the stone that you gave me. What's going on? We can't find a way out. We're trapped here." He Tian-Gang quickly explained the matter to Chun-Shi. It turned out that not long after the sun went down, the fog rose. Under He Tian-Gang's lead, the people cautiously tried to leave the oasis. However, no matter how they walked, they would eventually come to the giant tree. This situation should be the legendary ghostly wall. He Tian-Gang had no choice but to approach the giant tree and try to find clues from it. He did not expect that this would trigger the formation door and make a passage appear in front of them. What happened after that was similar to what happened to Chun-Shi. Metal, wood, water, fire, and earth. He Tian-Gang and the others had a mission, so they naturally did not dare to act rashly in the face of all kinds of strange situations. However, for some reason, along the way, although everyone knew that the things in the square were not to be touched, there were still people who could not control themselves and ran to touch those traps, thus losing their lives in vain. They kept moving forward in fear until they came to the hall in front of them. The hall was not dangerous, but there were no doors or windows. It was like a prison, completely trapping them here. After listening to He Tian-Gang's explanation, Chun-Shi could not help but frown. Not to mention the metal, wood, water, and fire formations. Just based on the earth formation at the end, how many people in this world could walk out alive with the exquisite layout of the formation within the formation? Chinshi thought that they had been wiped out long ago. Thinking of this, Chinshi could not help but ask in confusion, "How did you pass through the earth formation?" Hearing this, Tian was stunned and asked in confusion, "Earth formation? What's an earth formation?" "An illusion formation, like a dream. It will make you lose yourself in the dream and unable to wake up. You didn't encounter it?" "No." Tian shook his head, as if he understood Chunshi's question. He then explained, "The earth formation you're talking about is the last square, right? There was nothing there, only a mirror. We couldn't find any other way, so in the end, we tried to break the mirror, but we didn't expect to come here." After listening to Tiangong's description, Chunshi was silent. Directly skipping the earth formation? Based on the power of the earth formation, once they entered, there was absolutely no chance of survival for everyone present. Why didn't they trigger the earth formation? Could it be the earth formation only targeted immortal cultivators? Chunshi thought silently. He looked at Tiangang, then at the rest of the people. Then, he suddenly thought a question, so he quickly asked, "How long have you been here?" Hearing this, Tiangang could not help but smile bitterly and shake his head, sighing. "It's been more than a month. We only brought 2 months' worth of rations. If we can't find a way out, I'm afraid we'll starve to death here." "More than a month?" Because he was too shocked, Chinshi's face immediately showed an extremely shocked expression. He had not lost his composure like this for a long time. How long had it been since Tiangang threw the stone, then entered the formation and found the hall? It had only been a few hours. How could more than a month have passed? The flow of time in this place, could it be the same as Tianxian? Chapter 252. A year on Earth was equivalent to 100 years on Heavenly Spiral. How long had it been since Tiangang and the others entered the formation? How could more than a month have passed? Although he was very confused, Chinshi quickly regained his composure. They didn't notice anything unusual. After all, when it came to time, it was obviously not a problem that ordinary cultivators could solve. Perhaps only the legendary immortal emperors would be able to see through the true meaning behind it. If that was the case, then this palace, could it be that this was an excellent place for cultivation? Just like the House of Mind in Dragon Ball, a year in the outside world was only a day inside. A cultivation place like this was close to being a bug in the system. The flow of time in different places in the universe was different. In Einstein's theory of relativity, it was believed that time and space were related. When combined together, they would form a four-dimensional space-time coordinate and participate in the process of physical changes. A typical example could be given. For example, the greater the mass of an object, the slower the time around it would become. This was demonstrated very directly in Interstellar. Because it was close to a black hole, the male and female protagonists stayed on a planet full of water for a few hours. However, the crew members on the spaceship had already stayed on the spaceship for 23 years. When the male and female protagonists returned to the spaceship and met the crew members again, the crew members had already become white-haired old men. The reason why the flow of time on Heavenly Spiral was different from that of Earth was obviously because the mass of Heavenly Spiral was much greater than that of Earth. However, this palace was on Earth, so what was the reason for the flow of time in this palace to be different from that of the outside world? Chunshi was only at the soul formation stage. He hadn't even comprehended the void. Naturally, it was impossible for him to comprehend the true meaning of time. Therefore, after frowning and thinking for a while, he decisively threw this inexplicable phenomenon to the back of his mind. The most important thing now was to find a way to leave this palace. As for the rest, he would think about it later. Thinking of this, Chunshi couldn't help but look up at the dome. There were circles of strange patterns on the dome. It was as if a large net was hanging in the sky. He looked down at his feet. The floor of the palace looked dark and shiny. The materials seemed to be obsidian. The floor was not flat because there were many protruding lines on it. They looked similar to the lines on the dome. In a large hall, the white dome and black floor actually presented a different kind of beauty due to the similarity of the vein patterns. Apart from the giant stone pillar that supported the dome, there was nothing else in the hall. Chun-Shi circled the stone pillar, but didn't find anything out of the ordinary. So, in front of everyone's surprised eyes, he jumped up and flew directly to the dome. Seeing this, Tian couldn't help but smile. He clenched his fists and shouted excitedly, "We're saved!" Hearing this, the Wu Yin people were all overjoyed. The person in front of him was a legendary celestial. He must have a way to get them out of this damn place. Li Taidan and Xue Shujian had been by Chun-Shi's side for a few days now. When they saw Chun-Shi suddenly reveal such an inhuman side, they were shocked. Their eyes were wide open, and they couldn't say a word. Mr. Qin could fly? Could he be Superman? The people below were very excited, but after Chun-Shi flew to the dome, he couldn't help but frown. There was no light source in the hall, but it was still as bright as day. There wasn't even shadow. Standing in a hall was like standing under a shadowless lamp. There wasn't even a shadow to be seen. The light source seemed to be on the dome. Chun-Shi took a closer look and found that the material of the dome was somewhat like stone, but it had a faint metallic luster. It looked similar to the stone tablet at the entrance that was engraved with the words "warding off evil" and "sealing demons." Chun-Shi reached out his right hand and was about to touch the dome. However, the moment his palm touched the dome, the originally solemn hall suddenly shook violently. Chun-Shi was shocked and quickly retreated a few meters. Then he realized that the movement was coming from the stone pillar that supported the dome. The stone pillar kept shaking, and a strong force seemed to be breaking out of it. Seeing this, Chun-Shi immediately shouted to the people below, "Be careful!" Just as he finished speaking, like a fragmented grenade exploding in the hall, the giant stone pillar that supported the dome suddenly broke apart and turned into countless pieces that shot out in all directions. Chun-Shi's figure suddenly disappeared in the air. When he reappeared, he was already in front of Tian and the others. He held the sword with both hands and placed the Tian Yin sword in front of his chest. A light shield suddenly rose and protected Tian and the others. The giant stone pillar was at least 10 meters in diameter. Now that it suddenly exploded, thousands of pieces shot out in all directions in the hall, and there was a continuous crackling sound. If Chun-Shi wasn't here, Tian and the others would have been turned into a sieve by the flying pieces of stone, and there wouldn't even be a corpse left. The explosion soon subsided, and the pieces of the stone pillar were spread all over the floor. After Chun-Shi removed the light shield, Tian and the others carefully began to look around. The explosion just now was very fierce, but there wasn't even a scratch on the walls of the hall. From this, it could be seen how sturdy the hall was. The giant stone pillar that supported the dome turned into rubble, and at this moment, a pillar of light suddenly shot down from the dome. The pillar of light replaced the original stone pillar. Seeing this, Chun-Shi suddenly stabbed the Tian Yin sword into the ground. A light shield rose again, enveloping Tian and the others. "All of you stay here, don't move." After instructing everyone, Chun-Shi walked out of the light shield. Like sunlight peeking through the gaps in the clouds, the pillar of light was golden, and it faintly emitted a strong pressure. The pillar of light grew brighter and brighter. Everyone quickly averted their gazes. There was no way they could open their eyes in such a strong light. At this moment, Chun-Shi sharply noticed that a black shadow had appeared in the strong light. Roar! Following an earth-shattering roar, a snake-like thing suddenly pounced out of the pillar of light, heading straight for Chun-Shi. Seeing this, Chun-Shi immediately grasped the air, and a new celestial sword dharma appeared in his hand. As soon as the celestial sword dharma was formed, Chun-Shi held the long sword in his hand and directly slashed at the black shadow. A sword hidden in the air. The green sword radiance suddenly burst out. Like a long river hanging upside down, it swept up, surging true core energy and rushed into the sky, straight into the clouds. Roar! The black shadow let out a loud roar, and then collided with the sword radiance. Invisible energy waves exploded from the center of the collision, and instantly set off a strong windstorm in the hall. At this moment, Chun-Shi saw the black shadow clearly. It was actually a dragon. It wasn't a winged four-legged lizard in Western myths and legends, but a divine dragon that represented Hua Xia's spiritual culture. A creature that only existed in myths and legends had now appeared in front of Chun-Shi's eyes. Chapter 253. Air Your Wings said, "The dragon is the head of the scaled insect. It has 9 shapes. The head is like a camel, the horns are like a deer, the eyes are like a rabbit, the ears are like a cow, the neck is like a snake, the belly is like a snake, the scales are like a carp, the claws are like an eagle, the palms are like a tiger. There are 81 scales on its back, and it has the number of 99 suns. Its voice is like a copper plate. There is a beard beside its mouth, a pearl under its chin, and a reverse scale under its throat. There is a mountain on its head, also known as the ruler of wood. The dragon cannot fly without a ruler of wood. It can form clouds with its breath, and it can change into water and fire. But what is strange is that the appearance of this dragon is still somewhat different from the legendary 5-clawed golden dragon. The 5-clawed golden dragon is obviously golden, but the dragon in front of Chun-Shi is dark green. Or, this is an azure dragon? This azure dragon's body is about 30 meters long, and it seems to be bigger than the giant python in the Berserk Python disaster. It arches its body and floats in the air, and the dark green scales are at least the size of a palm. Looking carefully, the scales seem to be shining with an indescribable luster, which can be called flowing light and colorful. Dragons are a symbol of auspiciousness, but its appearance is definitely not cute, and it even looks a little ferocious. When this azure dragon stares at Chun-Shi with its golden vertical pupils, its eyes suddenly become like a human's, suddenly with a bit of fierceness. In this regard, Chun-Shi did not have much reaction, but the group of people behind him were frightened. Among them, a few of the less resolute ones were so frightened that they fell to the ground. This is a living dragon. After the azure dragon flew out of the light pillar, it immediately roared at Chun-Shi. The hidden dragon has fallen asleep, and its roar moves thousands of mountains. Seeing that the azure dragon was about to pounce, Chun-Shi raised his hand and slashed. However, this azure dragon did not dodge. When the sword hit its body, it was immediately like a water arrow hitting its body, and was immediately scattered by the dragon's scales. The azure dragon did not seem to expect that this little bug would dare to provoke its majesty, so it immediately roared. Following that, it danced in the air and pounced on Chun-Shi, who was on the ground. It waved its gigantic body and slammed down like a giant wave. Seeing this, Chun-Shi couldn't help but frown. Could it be? Was he going to slay a dragon today? Seeing this azure dragon charging over menacingly, Chun-Shi naturally could not sit still and wait for death. No matter what it was, he would beat it into submission first. Thus, Chun-Shi immediately held the Tian Yin sword in front of his chest. The tip of the sword suddenly shone brightly, releasing a burst of golden light. It was as bright as the sun, instantly illuminating the entire palace. Condensed the will as the spirit, and the spirit as the sword. The 8 extremities' boundless expanse was the so-called Earth Sword. 49 forms of heavenly divination, sword technique chapter. He Tian Gang and the others hid behind the shield that Chun-Shi had set up for them. When they saw what was happening in front of them, they couldn't help but cry out in alarm. After Chun-Shi slashed out with his sword, a burst of golden light shone brightly. The blinding light made it impossible for them to look directly at it, so they could only cover their eyes in pain. There was no word that could describe the sharpness of this sword. It was as if it could split the heavens and earth in half. Chun-Shi stood proudly with his sword in hand. The azure dragon's figure was no longer in his eyes, only a golden sword light that pierced through the heavens and earth. Then, the blue wave and the golden light collided violently. Roar! Following the azure dragon's roar, the entire palace began to shake violently. The stone pillars that were scattered all over the ground were now completely turned into fine powder under the impact of wave after wave of force. They were reduced to dust that could not even be seen by the naked eye. One move of the human sword was enough to wipe out a mountain, not to mention that Chun-Shi had just used the earth sword. But strangely, in the face of such a powerful impact, although the palace was shaking violently, the surrounding walls were not damaged at all. Not even a small crack appeared when the golden light dissipated. Other than the huge stone pillar that supported the dome, only a thick layer of dust was left on the obsidian floor. Everything seemed to be as good as new. As for the azure dragon, it was actually not affected at all. The azure dragon's speed was very fast. As soon as Chun-Shi slashed out with the earth sword, it had already arrived in front of Chun-Shi. Chun-Shi didn't even have time to slash out a second time before the azure dragon bared its fangs and claws and bit towards Chun-Shi. Seeing this, Chun-Shi's body suddenly glowed with golden light. He used his true chi to form a shield and prepare to take the azure dragon's attack head-on. But at this time, the azure dragon's figure directly passed through his body. Passed through, Chun-Shi was stunned, because at this time, he realized that the azure dragon was not real. It was just an illusion. No, it's wrong to call it an illusion, because it clearly received his attack just now. Chun-Shi raised his eyebrows and was about to turn around and slash again. But at this time, the azure dragon had already passed through the shield he set up for He Tiangang and crashed into He Tiangong's body. Although He Tiangang was a great master in the Alcade state, but to be honest, the Alcade state was only equivalent to a cultivator in the Qi refining stage. A battle of this level was obviously beyond He Tiangong's understanding. Therefore, He Tiangong's mind was blank. He didn't even have time to react. He could only watch as the 30-meter-long azure dragon drilled into his body. Yes, the azure dragon drilled into his body. The azure dragon's speed was very fast. In the blink of an eye, it had completely entered He Tiangong's body. Because this scene was so shocking, He Tiangang couldn't come back to his senses at all, until the azure dragon's figure disappeared from the hall and completely entered his body. He Tiangang still had a blank expression on his face. He Tiangang raised his hand and wanted to touch his chest. But at this time, a painful expression suddenly flashed across his face, and then he suddenly closed his eyes. Soon, He Tiangang opened his eyes again. But when he opened his eyes again, He Tiangong's eyes had turned into a pair of golden vertical pupils. They looked like the eyes of the azure dragon just now. At first glance, it was obvious that they were not eyes that a normal human could have. How dare you, evil creature! Seeing this scene, Chun-Shi couldn't help but fly into a rage. Because he finally understood, he had been fooled. No wonder the stone tablet at the entrance of the formation was engraved with the words, "Seal evil and repel demons." Could it be that the formation was suppressing this azure dragon? But this azure dragon was clearly just a remnant soul. It was only because his divine soul was damaged that Chun-Shi didn't notice the abnormality at first. Looking at He Tiangong's current appearance, it was obvious that this azure dragon had taken over his body. Seeing this, Chun-Shi immediately let go of the long sword, and then suddenly clasped his hands in front of his chest. Since this azure dragon was just a remnant soul, he would destroy its divine soul today. 49 Styles of Heavenly Divination, Spell Section. Chapter 254, Possession. When Chun-Shi saw what was happening to He Tiangang, he immediately flew into a rage. After letting out an angry grunt, Chun-Shi suddenly clasped his hands together in front of his chest. Then, he slowly pulled his palms apart. A golden light suddenly appeared between Chun-Shi's palms. As he slowly pulled his palms apart, the golden light became brighter and brighter. In the end, it was as if Chun-Shi was holding the sun in his hands. The dazzling light that seeped through the gaps between his fingers was so blinding that it was impossible to look at it directly. The golden light in Chun-Shi's hands grew even brighter. But in the eyes of the Wu Lian people, but they didn't see anything. This was because Evil Vanquisher was an attack on the soul. They were not immortal cultivators, so they naturally could not sense the fluctuations in the surrounding spiritual energy. However, although the others could not see it, the Azure Dragon in front of them clearly knew what was good for it. He Tiangang could be considered to have 8 lifetimes of bad luck. This Azure Dragon had probably been suppressed for too long, so as soon as it was released, it wanted to find a body to possess. It was not that the Azure Dragon was not interested in Qinshi, but the strength that Qinshi displayed just now was too strong. The Azure Dragon did not have absolute confidence, so it could only settle for the next best thing. Among everyone present, apart from Qinshi, He Tiangong's cultivation level was the highest. Naturally, he became the Azure Dragon's first target for possession. Because the difference in cultivation level between the two was too great, the Azure Dragon immediately seized control of He Tiangong's body as soon as it entered. After He Tiangong's body was possessed, his eyeballs immediately underwent a huge change. The pair of golden vertical pupils that originally belonged to the Azure Dragon appeared in He Tiangong's eye sockets, giving off a very strange feeling. Upon closer inspection, this pair of eyes that did not belong to a human seemed to faintly shine with an indescribable cold light. At this moment, Qinshi suddenly flipped his palm and pushed forward. The white sun flame immediately released a boundless pressure. It was like a spear filled with killing intent, and it instantly blasted towards He Tiangang. Seeing this, He Tiangong's eyes couldn't help but tremble. The vertical pupils in his eye sockets strangely shrank, completely turning into fine lines. But then his pupils suddenly widened, and there were 2 balls of red flames that kept pulsating in them. Then, He Tiangang opened his mouth and let out a roar at Qinshi that did not sound like a human at all. Roar! Following the roar, the 2 flames suddenly turned into 2 crimson dragons. A mighty fire tornado suddenly gushed out from He Tiangong's eyes, sweeping towards Qinshi. The golden light and the crimson flame collided violently. In an instant, like a cannonball hitting an armory, a shocking explosion occurred in the hall. The air seemed to be ignited by the raging flames, and the raging flames filled the entire space. However, this was a battle on the level of the spirit, so to outsiders, it was as if nothing had happened. Qinshi's spirit was damaged and could not directly use divine telekinesis to fight. But after such a long time of accumulation, his cultivation had mostly recovered, so the power of Evil Vanquisher was naturally far greater than before. However, what Qinshi did not expect was that his Evil Vanquisher, which he had used all his strength to unleash, was still blocked by the flames spewing out from He Tiangong's eyes. It was obvious how strong the remnant soul of this Azure Dragon was. Although Wu Lian and the others couldn't see what Qinshi and He Tiangang were doing, a battle of spirits of this level, just the spiritual storm created by the collision was enough to give them a splitting headache. Naturally, they couldn't pay attention to what was happening around them. Iron Egg Li and Xue Shujian were professional soldiers with strong willpower, but even so, they bitterly held on for about 5 seconds before their eyes rolled back, and they completely fainted. If even they were in such a state, there was no need to mention an ordinary person like Professor He, who had no foundation in cultivation. Seeing their companions collapse one after another, the remaining neutralizing grandmasters gritted their teeth and held on for about 10 seconds before collapsing to the ground one after another. Only 2 people remained standing in the hall. In contrast to Qinshi's calm and collected appearance, He Tiangong's condition was clearly much worse. Not only was his face pale, but his forehead was also covered in sweat. His tired appearance made him look like an athlete who had just finished a round of a marathon. After all, the Azure Dragon had just successfully taken over this body. This level of exhaustion was naturally a bit too much for it to bear. So when it saw Qinshi acting as if nothing had happened, the Azure Dragon's heart immediately trembled. It couldn't help but use He Tiangong's body to speak. "You are very strong. I have no grudge with you. Let me leave. I will remember your kindness." His accent was very strange. He sounded like a foreigner. It was just a short sentence, but it took a lot of effort to speak. Obviously, the Azure Dragon hadn't gotten used to this body yet and couldn't control it skillfully. Hearing this, Chun-Shi looked at him deeply, then replied with a serious face, "I can let you go, but the premise is you have to leave his body." No. Hearing that Chun-Shi wanted it to leave He Tiangong's body, the Azure Dragon immediately replied, "Without a body, I can't leave here." "Okay, then there's nothing to talk about." Chun-Shi shrugged indifferently, then said with a regretful expression, "I brought him here. You took over his body right in front of me, and now you want to leave safely like nothing happened? Let me tell you, there's no such thing as a cheap deal in this world." After hearing Chun-Shi's words, He Tiangong's expression immediately became uncertain, as if he was thinking. But Chun-Shi didn't intend to give him too much time to think. Although He Tiangong's body was occupied by the Azure Dragon, his consciousness obviously couldn't be swallowed by the Azure Dragon so quickly. So as long as the Azure Dragon's remnant soul was driven out of He Tiangong's body, then He Tiangang could still be saved. If time dragged on and the Azure Dragon completely merged with this body, even a golden immortal couldn't do anything. Seeing that the Azure Dragon still didn't answer, Chun-Shi decisively spread out his hands, and two dazzling lights lit up in his palms again. Since Evil Punisher couldn't destroy it, then he could try another move. Anyway, he had plenty of tricks up his sleeves. Seeing that Chun-Shi seemed to want to fight again, the Azure Dragon immediately cowered, so quickly said, "Wait, I have an idea." Hearing this, Chun-Shi immediately retracted his hands and asked, "What idea?" "You help me. Open the channel. After the channel is open, I'll come out from his body. Then you cover me and leave." "Okay." Chun-Shi pondered for a moment, so he readily agreed to the Azure Dragon's request. There was no exit in this hall, and the four walls were incomparably hard. Presumably, only the Azure Dragon knew how to get out. Since that was the case, there was no harm in cooperating. He helped the Azure Dragon escape, and the Azure Dragon left He Tiangong's body. Chapter 255. The man and the dragon quickly reached a consensus. After that, Chun-Shi learned the way to leave the hall from He Tiangang. The hall was like a sealed jar, and the only way out was above the dome. In the center of the dome, where the light beam came from, there was a crystal-like thing. As long as Chun-Shi flew up and took the crystal, they could leave this place. It sounded very simple, so Chun-Shi flew directly to the dome according to what the Azure Dragon said, and found a crystal in the center of the dome. It was a hexagonal, rhombus-shaped crystal, and its size was about the same as the crystal trophy used in award ceremonies. Chun-Shi tried to dig at the crystal with his hand, but to his surprise, the crystal was easily removed. The moment Chun-Shi removed the crystal, it was as if there was a huge earthquake outside, causing the entire hall to shake violently. Chun-Shi looked down and found that several cracks suddenly appeared on the walls around the hall. It was not right to call them cracks because these cracks were very neat, as if they could have been separated. Under Chun-Shi's slightly surprised gaze, the hall bloomed like a lotus in summer. The ground turned into a lotus pod, the walls turned into petals, and bloomed in front of Chun-Shi. The arc-shaped walls fell out one by one at a very fast speed, but they did not make any sound when they fell. The wind and snow that filled the sky suddenly came. Chun-Shi looked up and found that he was now in an observatory, and the spirit fog that covered the sky and the moon had disappeared. Everything happened very quickly. The moment the cracks appeared on the walls of the hall, He Tiangang suddenly showed a look of ecstasy. Almost without any hesitation, just as the wall cracked to reveal a gap big enough for an adult to leave, the Azure Dragon controlled He Tiangong's body and jumped out of the hall. "Run." As for the agreement between it and Chun-Shi, it was originally the Azure Dragon's stalling tactic. In fact, the Azure Dragon had never thought of leaving He Tiangong's body. After all, the heaven-defying act of seizing another's body was not without restrictions. This time, in order to seize He Tiangong's body, the Azure Dragon had already paid a great price. Therefore, Chun-Shi wanted it to obediently leave He Tiangong's body and look for a new body to seize. In the Azure Dragon's eyes, this was simply wishful thinking. With only a strand of remnant soul left, it could be said to be a rootless duckweed. Now that it had finally found a place to stay, the Azure Dragon naturally would not give up so easily. Although this body was still too weak at the moment, as long as it was given enough time, the Azure Dragon was confident that it could transform it into its original body. The little abacus in Azure Dragon's heart rang loudly, but it missed the most important point. That was, it did not have a correct understanding of Chun-Shi's cultivation. Therefore, as soon as He Tiangang moved, Chun-Shi, who was flying in the air, lowered his head and looked at He Tiangang's fleeing figure. There's a path to heaven, but you don't want to take it. There's no door to hell, but you insist on barging in. Since you're going back on your word, don't blame me for being merciless. Chun-Shi spread out his hands, and the vital essence in his body surged. Immediately, 2 balls of light appeared in his palms. Then, Chun-Shi held the 2 balls of light and quickly gestured in front of his chest. Suddenly, he slammed his palms toward He Tiangang's back. 49 forms of heavenly divination, Soul Tao Chapter. Tai Suppression, 3 Qis as 1, Soul Catcher. Soul Catcher was slightly different from Evil Vanquisher, because Soul Catcher was a pure spiritual attack. Chun-Shi's spiritual injury was very serious, so the moment he forcefully used Soul Catcher, his face flushed red. This move could be said to hurt the enemy 1,000 times, but hurt himself 800 times. However, the Azure Dragon had gone back on its word first. So today, Chun-Shi was determined to destroy its soul. No matter what kind of position it had in Chinese culture, in short, today, the proud dragon has no regrets. Perhaps sensing the pressure coming from behind, He Tiangang stepped on the snow and quickly leaped out. At the same time, he did not forget to look back. When he saw the golden light in Chun-Shi's hands, He Tiangang suddenly stopped. Then, he turned toward Chun-Shi and let out a resounding dragon roar. Roar! The roar of a tiger and the roar of a dragon was mighty and continuous. The Azure Dragon probably knew that today's matter could not be settled peacefully. Therefore, after this deep roar sounded from afar, the shadow of an Azure Dragon suddenly appeared behind He Tiangang. The hidden dragon sleeps, and its roar shakes thousands of mountains. The shadow of the Azure Dragon coiled in the air. At the same time that Chun-Shi slammed his palms, the shadow of the Azure Dragon soared into the air with a monstrous force. Like a giant python pouncing on its prey, it opened its bloody mouth and rushed toward Chun-Shi. At this moment, Chun-Shi seemed to see the shadow of great-granduncle in it. It was a very familiar scene, but Chun-Shi did not have time to think about it, because the Soul Catcher had been released. Like a descendant shooting down the sun, 2 light arrows shot out from Chun-Shi's hands directly toward the shadow of the Azure Dragon that was pouncing toward him. And at the moment when the light arrows and the shadow of the Azure Dragon collided in the air, the whole scene between heaven and earth seemed to be frozen. Snow fluttered in the snowy mountains. Under the sparse moonlight, the wind and snow filled the sky. The light arrows shot in from the dragon's head. After a flash, they pierced through the entire shadow of the Azure Dragon and directly entered He Tiangang's body. The resounding dragon roar sounded again, but this time it did not come from He Tiangang's mouth. Instead, it came from the shadow of the Azure Dragon. As if it had suffered a huge injury, the shadow of the Azure Dragon trembled violently. Then it curled up into a circle in the air, raised its head, and roared angrily toward the sky. Formless sound waves continuously sounded from the mouth of the Azure Dragon. Circle after circle, they spread in all directions. At the same time, He Tiangang, who was on the ground, stared with his slightly ferocious golden vertical pupils. There was a trace of disbelief on his face. However, the surprise on his face did not last long. After a few breaths of time, He Tiangang suddenly closed his eyes under the expressionless gaze of Chun-Shi, and then fell into the thick snow. At this time, the shadow of the azure dragon in the air, like a group of disturbed fireflies, suddenly turned into specks of starlight and disappeared in the wind and snow. The soul was destroyed. This azure dragon that only existed in myths and legends was mercilessly obliterated by Chen Shi. Everything returned to silence. Only the sound of the wind was left between heaven and earth. After looking at the diamond-shaped crystal in his hand thoughtfully, Chen Shi looked down at the hall below. Chapter 256. Chen Shi flew in the air and looked down at the scenery below. The thick spirit fog had dissipated, so his field of vision was wide open. After carefully observing his surroundings, Chen Shi found that he was now on a snowy mountain not far from the Ciala Mountain Pass. In other words, although the formation entrance was in the oasis, the formation core was the unknown snowy mountain next to it. The walls around the hall were not closed, like an open-air camp. The dark ground was in stark contrast to the surrounding white snow. The wind and snow were too strong, and the temperature was at least minus 60 degrees Celsius. Therefore, in just a few minutes, Wu Yin and the others lying on the ground were covered with a thin layer of snow. Chen Shi estimated that they would not wake up for a while, so he moved the survivors to the temporary laboratory in the oasis. After settling the group of people, Chen Shi flew back to the spacious hall and began to carefully study the rhombus-shaped crystal in his hand. This rhombus-shaped crystal was transparent, and a faint purple mist constantly rose in the middle. Chen Shi held his breath and silently felt the cold feeling coming from the crystal. But after studying it for a while, he still could not detect any signs of energy fluctuations from it. It was as if it was just an ordinary piece of natural crystal. But that was obviously impossible. If the hall was the cage that imprisoned the azure dragon, then this crystal was obviously the key. It was just that Chen Shi did not know how to use this key. The flow of time in the hall was different from the outside world, so this kind of cultivation place was undoubtedly very attractive to the current Chen Shi. If he had the key to the hall, then he could come here to cultivate when he had nothing to do. A cultivation place comparable to Tianxian. How could Chen Shi not be tempted? Thinking of this, Chen Shi could not help but show a trace of annoyance on his face. If he had known, he would not have hit so hard. The azure dragon didn't keep its word. Chen Shi was worried that Tiangong's soul would be devoured by the azure dragon if it dragged on, so he decisively killed him. Now that he thought about it, it was quite a pity. The main hall was obviously a cage used to suppress the azure dragon. Although they did not know how long it had been imprisoned here, judging from the azure dragon's behavior just now, it clearly had a certain degree of understanding of this main hall. However, it was too late to say anything now. He had already killed the azure dragon, so Chen Shi could only slowly explore the secrets of the hall. After pondering for a while, Chen Shi began pouring his true essence into the crystal. When the true essence flowed into the crystal, the dense purple qi in the crystal began to surge. There's hope. Seeing this, Chen Shi couldn't help but raise his eyebrows. He began to madly pour his qi into the crystal. The surging true essence continued to flow into the crystal, and the dense purple qi inside immediately began to revolve. As the dense purple gas spun faster and faster, a faint purple vortex gradually formed in the crystal like a glass of water being shaken. After that, Chen Shi held the crystal and looked at the main hall expectantly. However, he waited for a while, but there was no movement in the main hall. Is it scrapped? Chen Shi frowned and muttered to himself. Only then did he fly into the main hall and look at the surroundings with some regret. Before the main hall was unsealed, it was like a flower bud that had not bloomed. After Chen Shi plucked the crystal, the lotus began to bloom. With the base of the main hall as the center, the walls fell back one by one and split into 16 petals. The shape of each side was quite similar to the petals of the lotus. This shape, it did not look like the 9 lotus seeds under the gods. Chen Shi came to one of the walls and began to touch and knock on it, trying to find some useful clues. However, after studying for a while, he did not find anything strange, so he had to give up helplessly. This main hall was probably the same as the formation, which was a one-time use, so there was no way to restore it after it was activated. What a pity! Chun-Shi flew to the top of the main hall against the wind and snow. After reluctantly looking back at the black lotus blooming on the top of the snow mountain, he was about to leave with some regret. However, at the moment he turned around, Chun-Shi suddenly remembered a sentence that the Azure Dragon once said. Without a body, I can't leave here. Without a body, there is no way to leave here. Once this place was opened, the wind would blow on all sides. I could not get out. Thinking of this, Chun-Shi could not help but raise his eyebrows. He immediately turned around and flew into the main hall. Then he sat cross-legged on the obsidian floor. After setting up a defensive formation, he began to try to let his soul out of his body. Soul out of the body. For Chun-Shi, whose soul had been damaged, this was actually a very dangerous thing to do. If he was not careful, his soul might be destroyed, leaving only an empty shell without a soul. It was difficult for Chun-Shi to even use his divine sense, let alone his soul out of his body. Therefore, just as he was about to leave his body, he immediately suffered a backlash. His face could not help but turn pale. Chun-Shi had no choice but to temporarily stop this dangerous behavior, and then silently adjust his breathing. Danger always accompanied opportunity. This cultivation place was extremely tempting to Chun-Shi, so he did not want to give it up. Therefore, after a simple adjustment, Chun-Shi began to try again. Bit by bit, he let his soul out of his body. The shape of the soul was not fixed. Although the Azure Dragon had been imprisoned for a long time, its soul had always maintained the appearance of its original body. From this, one could see the strength of the Azure Dragon's soul. Because Chun-Shi's soul was damaged, his soul looked like a weak flame. It was so weak that it could be extinguished by the wind at any time. When the flame flew out from between Chun-Shi's eyebrows, Chun-Shi entered a mysterious state. He didn't need eyes or ears, but he could clearly see everything around him. Even how a snowflake fell from the sky and how many times it spun in the air. Chun-Shi was very clear. This was the so-called divine sense. It was a type of perception that transcended the five senses. It was like a radar, and even the rustling of grass in the wind could not escape his divine sense. After his soul left his body, Chun-Shi, who had turned into a flame, carefully approached the edge of the hall. And just as Chun-Shi's soul was about to float out of the hall, a bright light suddenly appeared in front of him. Sure enough, although the hall was still in the shape of a lotus platform, when Chun-Shi's soul approached the edge of the lotus platform, circles of strange light patterns immediately appeared around him. Looking carefully, the light patterns were exactly the same as the patterns carved on the dome. Looking at the ground, the protruding lines on the obsidian floor were also strangely glowing at this moment. In an instant, the sky and the ground were full of light patterns. Like two large nets, Chun-Shi was firmly trapped in the center of the hall. Inescapable net. Chapter 257. Looking at the strange light patterns that covered the sky in front of him, Chun-Shi was not surprised, but happy. Through the perception of his divine sense, he had already keenly noticed that the diamond-shaped crystal in his hand had a new change. The dense purple gas in the middle of the crystal was originally in the shape of a whirlpool, but when Chun-Shi's divine sense floated to the edge of the hall, the whirlpool immediately turned into the shape of a lotus, and the shape looked somewhat similar to the current appearance of the hall. Seeing this, Chun-Shi immediately returned his divine sense to his body, ending this dangerous action. After his divine sense returned to his body, Chun-Shi was still sitting cross-legged on the ground. After silently adjusting for a while, he finally opened his eyes. Forcing his divine sense to leave his body was still too much for the current Chun-Shi. Therefore, after just a few minutes, his face became very pale, and he looked like a patient who had just recovered from a serious illness. However, although his face was ugly, Chun-Shi could not help but smile, because he discovered a secret, and that was this seemingly ordinary crystal was actually the legendary Soul Crystal. The so-called soul crystal was actually a strange crystal that could host the divine sense. This kind of crystal was also very rare in the Tianyuan world. The soul crystal was very precious. On one hand, it was extremely rare, and on the other hand, it was a necessary material to refine divine sense attack-type magic treasures. In addition to being able to refine magic treasures, the soul crystal, as a kind of spiritual treasure, had the effect of warming and nourishing the divine sense. With the environment on Earth, it was obviously impossible to breed a magical medicine that could heal divine sense injuries. Therefore, this soul crystal was definitely a life-saving straw for Chun, she whose divine sense was injured. No wonder this hall could imprison the Azure Dragon's divine sense. It was obviously because of this soul crystal. Thinking of this, Chun she had a rough understanding of the mechanism of the hall's operation. Using the soul crystal as the eye of the formation to imprison the Azure Dragon, who was only left with his divine sense. And the reason why He Tiangang and the others had not triggered any mechanism after being trapped for more than a month was they were not immortal cultivators, so they did not have enough pure, true essence to trigger the mechanism. Therefore, this array formation and the main hall were obviously set up by immortal cultivators. Moreover, this unknown immortal cultivator was at least at the insightful emptiness realm. Otherwise, it would be impossible for him to set up such a grand formation that involved the true meaning of the word void. With the soul crystal as the core of the formation, if not for his appearance and triggering the mechanism in the hall, the Azure Dragon who had lost his physical body would never have been able to escape the seal. There are also immortal cultivators on Earth. Thinking of this, Chun Shi suddenly frowned. It was said that the proud dragon had no regrets, but now he was a little regretful. He should have left Azure Dragon alive to interrogate him. But what was done, and there was no point in regretting it now. Therefore, Chun Shi could only put this question aside for the time being. Then, he closed his eyes and concentrated, trying to let his spirit enter the soul crystal. The soul fire once again flew out from between Chun Shi's eyebrows, and then directly flew into the diamond-shaped crystal in his hand. After Chun Shi's spirit flew into the soul crystal, a feeling as warm as the sun in March immediately enveloped his spirit. It was a very wonderful experience, and it made Chun Shi feel very comfortable. His injured spirit could only sense things within a radius of 10 meters, but after his spirit entered the soul crystal, the range of Chun Shi's divine sense suddenly expanded and covered the entire mountain in an instant. In an instant, with the crystal as the center, Chun Shi could sense every movement in the wind and grass. This feeling, he had not experienced it for a long time. Nourishing the spirit was an additional effect of the soul crystal. Naturally, it would not be as fast as the magic medicine, and it would take a long time. Therefore, at this time, Chun Shi could not help but think of the main hall. As soon as he thought of this, a series of rumbling sounds suddenly came from the hall. Following that, the 16 walls began to slowly rise up and gradually close together. The main hall changed back to its original appearance. The soul crystal, which was the core of the array, could still control the main hall. Seeing this, Chun Shi could not help but feel happy. He immediately counted silently in his heart. He wanted to calculate the difference between the flow of time in the main hall and the outside world. Chun Shi enjoyed the nourishment of the soul crystal as he counted seriously. When he counted to 10,000, Chun Shi thought of something again. The main hall was suddenly like a remote-controlled toy, and it slowly bloomed with a rumbling sound. Each number was exactly 1 second. In other words, he stayed in the main hall for about 166 minutes. Before the main hall was fully opened, Chun Shi excitedly flew out of the main hall and rushed directly in the direction of the temporary laboratory. When he brought everyone back to the laboratory, it was about 1:30 in the morning. He counted 10,000 seconds in the main hall, 166 minutes, which was 7 hours. According to the flow of time that He Tiangang said, if the main hall did not lose its effect, then only about 2 minutes had passed in the outside world. The more Chun Shi thought about it, the more excited he became. He quickly rushed back to the oasis from the top of the mountain. There was a quartz clock in the temporary laboratory. The answer he wanted was there. The wind and snow were still in the sky. Thick dark clouds blocked the moonlight, so the surroundings were pitch black. After nervously opening the storm door of the laboratory, Chunshi saw Tiangang and the others, who were still unconscious. In the dim laboratory, only one energy-saving lamp was still on. Next to the energy-saving lamp was the quartz clock that Professor he had brought. Chunshi walked to the table and looked down at the time on the table. He was stunned. The time on the quartz clock indicated that it was 1:55 in the morning. When he left, the time should be around 1:34 in the morning. Putting aside some errors, it should be around 20 minutes. However, he stayed in the main hall for a full 10,000 seconds. In other words, the ratio of the flow of time between the main hall and the outside world should be about 8 times. It was not as exaggerated as 100. However, even if it was only 8 times the time difference, it was more than enough for Chunshi. One day in the outside world was 8 days in the main hall. What kind of concept was that? Chunshi thought about it for a while. However, he vaguely felt that something was wrong. According to what Tianyang said, they had been trapped in the hall for more than a month. Why was it that the time difference between the hall and the outside world was only 8 times that of the outside world? A month in the main hall should be at least 4 days in the outside world. Chunshi thought about it for a long time, but could not figure it out. In the end, he could only put this question to the back of his mind. He planned to confirm it after Tiangang woke up. In short, it did not matter if it was 8 times or 100 times. This time, he had really found a treasure. After confirming the use of the main hall and the soul crystal, Chunshi immediately set up a restriction in the temporary laboratory. As soon as someone woke up, he would know immediately. After that, Chunshi plunged into the main hall and began to use the soul crystal to heal the injuries to his soul. Because his soul was out of his body, he could not cultivate. Therefore, in his boredom, he could not help but let his imagination run wild. Starting tomorrow, after Ninian fell asleep, he could secretly bring Ying here. Then they could cultivate together as husband and wife. And Chapter 258. Morning, 6:27 a.m. When Chunshi sensed that someone had woken up in the laboratory through the restriction, he stopped cultivating for the night. Although only 4 hours had passed in the outside world, he had stayed in the hall for a full day and a half. Time and space were concepts that were both independent and interconnected. This was not the heavenly jade realm, but Earth. Other people only had 24 hours a day on Earth, and Chunshi was also on Earth. However, he could extend his day to nearly 200 hours through the hall. What did 200 hours mean? It was enough to turn a newbie who didn't even know how to loot a bag into a sly old fox who lay in the bushes and waited patiently for a delivery. This kind of miraculous effect that could be called a miracle naturally moved Chunshi, who had never been moved by external things. As for why the flow of time in the hall was different from the outside world, this question was too profound and was completely beyond the level of a soul formation cultivator. Therefore, Chunshi was at a loss at this moment. He couldn't figure it out. Although the hall was very mysterious, Chunshi vaguely felt a sense of anticipation in his heart. Perhaps this hall, which involved the true meaning of time, was not only an excellent place for cultivation, but also a necessary step for him to take another step above the soul formation stage. The hall was too important for Chunshi. Therefore, when he left, Chunshi set up an illusion formation around the hall and hid the hall openly. From now on, this would be his secret base. For this, Chunshi had even made up a very believable story. If Wu Lian started an investigation, he would just have to say that it was all an illusion. The reason why Tiangang and the others were trapped in the hall for more than a month was because they were under an illusion and mistakenly thought that they had been trapped in the hall for more than a month. In reality, they had only slept for one night and had a very, very long dream. Since the hall and the formation were both dreams, then the Azure Dragon was also a product of the dream. From the beginning to the end, Chunshi only did one thing, and that was to wake them up from their dreams. As for why everyone had the same dream, it was because the illusion was affecting everyone. In addition, the reason why the team had lost members was because the illusion had misled these weak-willed members. It was like sleepwalking, causing them to leave the camp in an unconscious state and then completely disappear in the vast snowy mountains. This trip probably bodes ill rather than well. In short, being able to survive was all due to luck. Everything that everyone experienced was just a dream and illusion. It was a perfect explanation. At the same time, it was Chun-Shi's white lie. After all, what was the point of Wu Lian sending so many people if even he couldn't figure it out? I'll fool him first, and he'll slowly investigate in the future. By the time Chun-Shi returned to the laboratory, only the two neutralizing grandmasters were awake. When he Tiangang and the professors woke up, it was already 10 o'clock in the morning. Because he had almost been possessed by the Azure Dragon, He Tiangong's mental state was very bad after waking up. When Chun-Shi saw this, he told him to rest well. Although Chun-Shi's cultivation was very high, he wasn't an official member of the Wu Lian. Therefore, He Tiangang was actually the person in charge of this mission. After that, Chun-Shi explained the lie he had made up in detail in front of everyone. When everyone finished listening to his explanation, they all had extremely shocked expressions on their faces. Such a realistic experience was actually just a dream. Although everyone felt that this matter was too strange, there was still time to prove it. Therefore, after digesting it, they could only reluctantly believe Chun-Shi's words. This so-called dreamland was indeed a little too ridiculous for them. In fact, if they thought about it carefully, they could find many loopholes in Chun-Shi's words. For example, how could they explain the smell of dirt on their bodies after not bathing for more than a month? Also, how could they explain the consumption of food over the past month? There were too many suspicious points. No one was an idiot. However, Chun-Shi's words were reasonable, and there was also time to prove it. Therefore, no matter how doubtful everyone was, they had to convince themselves to believe Chun-Shi's words in the end. After all, they couldn't think of a better explanation. The team had inexplicably lost members. This was a serious matter. Therefore, even though He Tiangang still didn't understand the situation, he still honestly recorded everything in the mission log. Just like what Chun-Shi said, it was already good enough that they survived. As for what exactly happened last night, this was obviously not a question he should be thinking about now, because he was also a smart person. The snow had been blowing heavily all night. Now it was finally sunny. He Tiangang had already seen the strangeness of the oasis. Therefore, the first thing he did after the weather cleared was to move the temporary laboratory to the edge of the oasis. It was about 200 meters away from the oasis on a glacier plain. At this moment, he would rather be in an environment of minus 50 degrees Celsius in the cold wind than easily get close to the oasis. As long as the professors finished collecting the data, He Tiangang could take everyone on a trip and leave. However, this process would take about 10 hours. Because of this, He Tiangang's heart was almost in his throat. He could only keep praying in his heart that nothing would go wrong. Unlike He Tiangang, who was on tenterhooks, Chun-Shi was very calm. After patrolling the area with everyone, Chun-Shi stuffed a stone into He Tiangang's hand. The spirit fog dissipated and mysterious five elements formation also disappeared. Although the hull didn't disappear, the soul crystal, which was the core of the formation, was in his hands. The danger was gone. So Chun-Shi was thinking, was it time for him to get off work and go home? It was almost noon. If Nian didn't see him when she woke up, would she cry to Ying? When he thought of the little girl's clingy look, Chun-Shi suddenly became eager to go home. He couldn't wait to fly back to the little girl's side. After last night's experience, when He Tiangang saw Chun-Shi handing over another stone, he didn't even wait for Chun-Shi to speak. He Tiangang rushed to take the stone and smiled. I understand. Mr. Chun, go do your work. I'll throw the stone if there's anything. Hearing this, Chun-Shi suddenly smiled. Saving his life was worth it. This He Tiangang was interesting. After talking with He Tiangang, Chun-Shi left the Saikin Glacier. When he returned to Chengdu, it was already 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Chun-Shi hid his body and landed in a secluded alley behind Wuho Shrine Street. He had just walked out of the alley and looked up to see that the entrance of Aunt Zhang's neighborhood was crowded with people. A police car was parked by the side of the road. Many people surrounded the security booth and discussed. Looking at the situation, it seemed that something big had happened in the neighborhood. Although they were separated by a street, Chun-Shi's ears were very sharp. Therefore, when he walked to the neighborhood, a conversation among the onlookers instantly made Chun-Shi frown. I heard that a child was kidnapped. What a big child. For a 5 years old. Is it a boy or a girl? Little girl. She looks so obedient. Oh, why don't those bastards get their retribution? Xiao Qiu is so wicked. He's probably been hit by a car and died on the road. Attention Lamakes 666. Chapter 259. There was a child abducted in the community. A 4 or 5-year-old child, a little girl. When Chun-Shi heard this conversation, he couldn't help but frown deeply. Although he also knew that it was impossible for Nian to be abducted. As a father, Chun-Shi still subconsciously thought of Nian, so his heart was more or less a little nervous. There weren't many things in this world that could make him nervous. Nian's safety was obviously the first priority, but Nian couldn't have been abducted. Impossible. Absolutely impossible. Even if the earth exploded, it was impossible. This was because he put a lot of enchantment magic weapons on Nian. Once the enchantment was triggered, even if Chun-Shi was far away on the moon, he would immediately know. Moreover, with Qin Ruing and Aunt Zhang's meticulousness, it was obviously impossible for them to let Nian run around alone, so they basically eliminated the possibility of Nian getting lost. However, even if he knew that this was impossible, Chun-Shi was still a little worried, so he subconsciously quickened his pace. In the blink of an eye, he had already arrived at the gate of the community. Annie Zhang's neighborhood was an old-fashioned neighborhood that didn't even have elevators. Naturally, there wouldn't be any grand decorations at the entrance of such a neighborhood. Even the railings for parking fees were only built after cars became popular. There were many people gathered at the gate of the community. Most of them were uncles and aunties above the age of 40. The family who lost a child lived in the building next to Aunt Zhang's. The child's parents had to work, so it was usually the grandparents who took care of the child. Now that the child was lost, the old couple could only sit on the ground and cry helplessly. The old couple was so sad that they couldn't speak, but the onlookers were talking one after another, giving the police who came to check the situation a headache. After all, losing a child attracted more attention than jumping off a building. There were only 3 surveillance cameras in the community, and one of them was at the gate. However, the resolution of these cameras wasn't high, and they were in black and white, so the images looked very blurry. After the police checked the surveillance footage based on the time when the child went missing, it took them a lot of effort to find the footage of the child leaving the neighborhood. The child ran out on her own, but she was following behind a woman riding an electric scooter. It seemed that she was willing. Human traffickers generally liked to abduct children under the age of 5 because the children's minds were not fully developed yet. Naturally, they would not be vigilant and would be pleased with toys or candy. Speaking of human traffickers, it was actually an occupation with a long history. In ancient times, there was a saying that there were 3 religions and 9 classes. Human traffickers were one of the 9 classes. In ancient times, they were called demons of time. They did immoral things like abducting people. However, compared to modern times, human traffickers in ancient times were still too naive. After abducting women and children, they would only sell them for money. If the abducted women and children were lucky, they might even be sold to a rich family and live a better life than before. Now, in addition to human trafficking, human traffickers have also found a new way to sell organs. Abduct the child first, sell the organs, and then sell the child for money. If the child couldn't be sold, then break the child's arms and legs and let the child beg. If begging didn't work, then let them steal. What if they couldn't even steal? That was very simple. Throw them into the AIDS ward. If they tested positive for AIDS, they would be assigned to the AIDS team. In the future, they would be responsible for collecting debts. If there was a debt collector who didn't pay up, Then they would think of ways to infect the debt collector. In short, they made the best use of everything, and their methods were beyond the imagination of ordinary people. It could be said that utterly devoid of conscience. To the human traffickers, children were just valuable goods in their eyes. The big goods were boys, and the small goods were girls. Of course, there were only a few such large-scale human traffickers. Ordinary small fish and shrimps would not be so cruel. Nowadays, parents were aware of this, so they would teach their children not to talk to strangers from a young age. Under such circumstances, this woman was able to get the child to leave with her willingly. She was obviously a repeat offender. If she was caught, she would definitely be shot to death. It was just after the new year, and the human traffickers were already at work. Parents with children at home naturally felt afraid. Since one went missing, there was a possibility that a second one would go missing. Therefore, a few onlooking parents immediately used this opportunity to educate their children. Suddenly, the children were so scared that they started to cry. Outside the community was an old street, and there were no cameras. Therefore, the police had to carefully look through the entry and exit records for the entire day. After a long search, they finally found the woman's face. However, this woman had a certain level of anti-detection awareness. She was wearing an ordinary down jacket with a hood, and she even wore a hat. Therefore, the woman's face could not be seen clearly on the surveillance screen. Seeing this, the two police officers suddenly looked at each other helplessly. Well, this was probably another unsolved case. It wasn't that they didn't work hard, but they really couldn't do anything. As parents, they didn't look after their children and let their children be abducted by human traffickers. Even if they called the police in time, in this vast sea of people, where could the police find them? They could only walk through the streets and ask door to door. They would be thankful if they could get a little bit of useful information. After all, the human traffickers were not stupid. The kind of idiot who suddenly wanted to commit a crime because of a lack of money was always in the minority. The habitual criminals would definitely plan a retreat in advance. It was indeed difficult to catch. Chun-Shi walked around the crowd into the community. From afar, he saw Aunt Zhang's family and Qin Ruoying, who was holding the little boy. The little boy was lying on Qin Ruoying's body, his two hands tightly wrapped around her neck. His little face was full of nervousness and timidity. Aunt Zhang probably took the opportunity to educate him. Chun-Shi squeezed into the crowd and walked in their direction. The little boy stood high and could see far, so before he could get close, he had already seen his father in the crowd. He immediately shouted excitedly, "Papa! Papa!" Seeing this, Chun-Shi immediately smiled and waved at him, then quickly walked to Qin Ruoying's side. When Chun-Shi came over, the little boy immediately reached out his hands and motioned for Chun-Shi to hold him. This action was very common, but the slightly different thing was that when the little boy saw his father this time, his cute little face did not show much of a smile. She was obviously frightened, like a frightened ostrich. As soon as the little boy came into Chun-Shi's arms, he immediately leaned his head on Chun-Shi's shoulder. Chapter 260. The little girl was scared out of her wits because Annie Zhang had just taught her a lesson by scaring her. Although the little girl was scared and seemed to be traumatized, she didn't think there was anything wrong with Annie Zhang's behavior. After all, if she didn't pay attention to education in this area, it would be too late for regrets when the child was taken away by human traffickers. Although that was basically impossible, setting an alarm bell in Yin Yin's heart in advance was always a precautionary measure. Human trafficking had always been the most serious topic of this era. Behind it was the dark side of civilized society. Why did human traffickers like to abduct children under the age of 5? It wasn't just because children were easy to deceive, but because children couldn't remember things. After 2 or 3 years, they basically didn't recognize their biological parents. Instead, they would treat the family that adopted them as their closest relatives. After many years, even if the child had a little bit of memory before they were abducted, it was usually just fragmented fragments and not enough for them to recall the complete experience. Ordinary people might feel that this kind of thing was far away from them, So whenever they saw news about it, they felt like they were listening to a book from heaven and had no interest in it at all. But all of this was actually close at hand. According to statistics, there were as many as 20,000 cases of human trafficking of women and children in the country in 2015, but the number of cases that were solved was only 3,000. The solving rate was only 17%, not even 20%. And behind these simple numbers, there were families that were shattered because of the loss of their children, as well as parents who were devastated. Human traffickers didn't need to be ruthless like the underworld, so they usually looked ordinary. They might be kind aunties passing by on the street corner, or they might be honest farmers. But under those seemingly harmless skins, there was a cold and cruel heart. Therefore, in Chun-Shi's view, there were two kinds of behavior in this world that could be called heinous and could be directly shot once caught. And that was drug dealers and human traffickers. The Western region had always been the disaster area of human trafficking cases. Although Chengdu had successfully become a new first-tier city in recent years, this kind of thing was still a common occurrence. Auntie Zhang's goal of educating the child had been achieved, so she waved her hand and asked everyone to go home. During this time, she pursed her lips and didn't say a single word. In fact, whether it was Aunt Zhang or the onlookers, they could only feel a deep sense of helplessness at the same time. This also caused the atmosphere at the entrance of the residential area to be very oppressive. The old couple who had lost their child sat on the ground and cried miserably. Chapter 261. Seeing that her father had saved someone, the expression on the little girl's face suddenly became triumphant. Everyone praised Chun-Shi loudly. After a few polite and modest words, Chun-Shi retreated to the back of the crowd with Ying and Yin. His appearance was like a sudden ray of light in the darkness. Even if the old man was half a step into the gates of hell, Chun-Shi still managed to save the old man very smoothly. In the news, it was often seen that the old lady would suddenly die shortly after she had a dispute with others. A large part of the reason was that the old lady's heart was not good. If she was not careful and was stimulated, she could die of sudden cardiac death. The police were also frightened by the old lady's physical condition, so they did not dare to ask them to go back to the police station now. They could only wait for the ambulance to come and send the old lady to the hospital for a checkup. However, even though the old lady was lucky to survive, the first thing she did after waking up was to look at the crowd and cry, "Where's my granddaughter? Where's my granddaughter?" When the old man saw his wife's sad look, he could not help but feel sad. The old couple immediately hugged each other and cried bitterly. The old lady was so pitiful. This also made Qin Ruoying feel kind. So, she gently tugged at Chun-Shi's clothes and asked in a low voice, "Can you help them?" Chun-Shi turned his head and saw his wife's slightly expectant gaze. He could not help but nod. But then he frowned slightly. After all, it was very troublesome to find a person in a vast sea of people. If it were not for his sister-in-law taking the initiative to come to him, Chun-Shi might not have found Qin Ruoying until now. So, he was also aware of the difficulties. However, this kind of thing happened in front of him. Seeing the old lady's pitiful appearance, Chun-Shi still felt a little sorry for her. So, he made up his mind to find their child for them. As for how to find her, he had to think about it carefully. So, Chun-Shi came to the security room and asked to see the surveillance video. Because he had just saved the old lady, the security guard's attitude towards him was very friendly. Almost as soon as Chun-Shi suggested his idea, the security guard began to retrieve the surveillance footage for him. I saw that woman come in. She was riding a battery-powered scooter. She should be in her 40s or 50s, but it was just a glimpse, so I can't remember clearly. Do you have a picture of the child? Yes, this is a recent photo of the doll. Uncle Lee just showed this to the police. I saved a copy, and I'm going to put up a missing person notice on the door later. Chun-Shi looked at the child's photo carefully. After memorizing the child's appearance, he nodded and said to the security guard, "Okay, I'll go out and ask my friends to help me see if there are any clues about the child." After seeing the surveillance camera and the child's photo from a security guard, Chunshi returned to Qin Ruoying's side. When the little fellow heard that her father was going to help find someone, she immediately pulled a long face and cheered for Chunshi righteously. "Papa, you can do it. I'll wait for you at home." Well, this little thing now knows how to help others. However, finding someone was not as simple as what was shown in the movies. It was possible to hack into the Skynet system and then use a computer to scan and compare. Although this operation was feasible to a certain extent, the success rate was far lower than imagined. After all, as long as it was not an impulsive crime, the criminals would definitely check out the place in advance and try to avoid the surveillance cameras when committing the crime. They would also disguise themselves to a certain extent. Although Chun-Shi's divine sense had recovered a little, the range was still too small. The scanning radius of only more than 10 meters was not even as far as he could see directly with his eyes. Because the injury to his divine sense had not fully recovered, Chun-Shi could not use search spells such as bloodline tracking or divine sense searching. Now, it was really too difficult for him to find a child who had been abducted and sold in a city with an area of more than 800 square kilometers and a resident population of more than 10 million. However, although it was difficult, since he had promised Ying that he would help the old lady, Chun-Shi would try his best to do it. He would just take it as accumulating good karma for himself. Although he could not directly find out the whereabouts of the human traffickers, Chun-Shi could use his own reasoning to find them. How to reason? It was actually very simple. First of all, the left turn out of the neighborhood was Wuho Temple Street, and the right turn was the alley where Chun-Shi had landed on his way back. After the human traffickers had deceived the child, it was impossible for them to run to the main street, so the alley without cameras was the only choice. The child was about the same age as Ninian. At the age of 4, the child already had his own consciousness. Once the child found out that he had been deceived, he would definitely cry and make a fuss. Therefore, the human traffickers would not choose to leave Chengdu by bus or train. They must have their own means of transportation, and it was very likely that it was a cheap and affordable van or a second-hand car. Of course, if the human traffickers did not have a means of transportation, it would be easier. They would definitely temporarily put the child in a stronghold and then contact a car for transportation. Time was another key clue. From the time the child went missing until now, it had not been more than an hour. As a family, the most important thing was to be neat. Chun-Shi sat patiently on the rooftop. It was not until around 6 o'clock in the evening that the woman's accomplice came back one by one. When all the human traffickers gathered on the first floor to prepare for dinner, Chun-Shi realized that this human trafficking organization was much bigger than he thought. They rented this building, and it seemed that there were at least 20 to 30 people, men and women, old and young. Among them, the youngest should be around 20 years old. They should all be from the same village, earning money together and committing crimes together. They usually lived in this cheap tube-shaped building, and then they would wander around in groups of 3 to 5 in the name of working. Once they found a target, they would start to plan the operation. Some were responsible for scamming, some were responsible for robbing, and some were responsible for keeping watch, scouting, and logistics. Although they were small, they had all the essentials. Among these children, some were caught before the new year, but they did not choose to ship the goods during the new year. Instead, they chose to ship the goods after the new year. Moreover, when they shipped the goods, they divided them into several batches to avoid being caught by the police. They were very experienced in committing crimes. Chun-Shi was also very patient and waited quietly for more than 3 hours. It was not until 10 o'clock in the evening, when 8 or 9 people came back, that he stood up and slowly stretched. It should be about time. Only the little girl who heard the sound of Chun-Shi opening the door immediately raised her head and looked outside vigilantly. There was only an old light bulb in the room. Under the dim light, the sudden appearance of a strange man made the girl shrink back in fear. The little girl's movements made a rustling sound. After hearing this sound, the woman in the room finally raised her head impatiently and directly shouted in Chun-Chi's direction. She thought it was a pervert who wanted to take advantage of this little girl. This kind of thing happened more than once, so she didn't care at all. But she didn't expect that after looking up, she found that she didn't know the man in front of her at all. The woman was stunned. She was stunned for a second or two. Then, her eyes suddenly widened, and she was about to scream. But at the moment when she was about to scream, Chun-Chi suddenly stretched out his arm, and the invisible true spirit suddenly clasped the woman's neck like an iron hoop. Want to call for help? The two were at least 2 meters apart. Chun-Chi just grabbed in the air, and the woman was suddenly lifted from the chair by him, like a chicken. The pressure on her neck made the woman almost suffocated, but she still opened her eyes and mouth, trying to make a sound. Seeing this, Chun-Chi said calmly, "I'll help you." After the voice fell, Chun-Chi gently waved his arm. The woman's body was like a marionette. Under the pull of an invisible force, she instantly broke the window and flew directly out of the 5th floor. Then the question came, how long would it take for an object to fall freely from the height of a 5-story building to fall to the ground? The answer was, with a muffled sound from downstairs, the entire apartment was alarmed. Like a sudden power outage in the student apartment, screams and footsteps suddenly came from downstairs. This scene happened in front of the little girl, but she stared with her red eyes, as if she didn't come back to her senses at all. Seeing her silly look, Chun-Chi couldn't help but smile at her. Then he gently snapped his fingers. "Go to sleep. You'll be fine when you wake up." Under the effect of the meditation spell, the little girl leaned weakly against the wall, and her consciousness became more and more blurred. She tried hard to remember the appearance of the man in front of her, but the strong sleepiness made her instantly fall asleep. After the little girl fell asleep, Chun-Chi turned his head to look at the child in the room. After cutting all the ropes with his true essence, he turned and walked out of the room. 30 to 40 people ran wildly in the apartment, and the floor made a bang-bang sound as they stepped on it. Listening to the gradually approaching footsteps, Chun-Chi sighed rather helplessly. It would be great if he could just slaughter all of these scumbags, but he couldn't do that. So, he quickly rolled down the window and then shouted at the little guy who was still trying to ride, "Nin, nin, nin, do you want to go to heaven?" After hearing his father's call, the little thing immediately looked up at Chun-Chi and grinned. "Papa, this is fun. I want to ride." As she spoke, she twisted the bell on the bike, but the more she twisted it, the more energetic she became. At this time, Aunt Zhang, who was sitting in the back, could not stand it anymore. So she said to Chun-Chi, "Why aren't you going to carry her back? Look at how you've spoiled her." Chun-Chi was inexplicably scolded, and he did not know whether to laugh or cry. Just when Chun-Chi opened the door and got off, Aunt Zhang did not forget to remind him, "Be careful. Don't let her fall." It could be seen that Grandma really had a sharp tongue, but a soft heart for her granddaughter. After giving Qin Roing a look, Chun-Chi quietly went behind the little guy, and then, when she was not paying attention, he lifted her up by her armpits. If it was in the past, the little guy would be overjoyed to be ambushed by her father, but today, she might be relying on this shared bike. Therefore, when she realized that she was being carried away by her father, the little guy burst into tears on the spot. Before Papa and Mama got angry, the little guy was the first to flip out. The sudden crying almost scared Chun-Chi, so he quickly touched the back of her head and comforted her. "Oh, Nian Nian, don't cry, don't cry. You're so young, so you can't ride a shared bike. Papa will ride with you in the future, okay?" Hearing this, the little guy cried even louder. What should they do? The couple could not help but look at each other, and neither of them hardened their hearts to play the role of the good cop. At this time, it was natural for the elderly to step in. Aunt Zhang asked Chun-Shi to put the little guy in the back. Then she quietly communicated with the little guy. Don't cry. If you cry again, I'll sell you to human traffickers. Yin Yin, look at you now. You're not likable anymore. Do you still remember what you told Grandma before? Isn't our Yin Yin the most obedient and sensible? Be good. You have to listen to Papa and Mama. If you make Papa and Mama angry again, be careful that they throw you away again. Then you can only live with Grandma in the future. What? You don't want to live with Grandma? Grandma is so sad. My granddaughter doesn't want me anymore. After all, she was a child that the elderly had personally raised. After a round of threats and temptations, Aunt Zhang managed to divert the little guy's attention to other places. The little guy did not even wipe his tears before he took the initiative to hug Aunt Zhang and said softly, I want Grandma. Grandma is the best. The older, the wiser. Actually, it was possible to scare the child, but one must not use it as a tactic. After scaring the child to make him realize that he was wrong, it was necessary to divert the child's attention in time and let them temporarily forget what was in front of them. Otherwise, it was very likely that overdoing it would be as bad as not doing enough. If it was more serious, it could even cause a certain degree of psychological trauma to the child. Aunt Zhang educated the little guy in a low voice, but her words were passed to the couple's ears without missing a word. The couple sat in the front row. At some point, Chun-Shi's hand was no longer on the gear lever, but stretched out to the front passenger seat. The two silently felt the warmth from each other's palms. When the little guy's laughter sounded again, Qin Ruoying smiled and patted Chun-Shi's hand away, then pointed to the road ahead and said with a smile, Drive carefully. Okay, yes, ma'am. The car was quiet, so Chun-Shi turned on the radio. Maybe it was set up by the previous tenant, so when it was turned on, it was the traffic radio channel. Pleasant music suddenly sounded in the car. This song could be considered a familiar Cantonese song. After listening to a sentence, Chun-Shi could not help but hum along with the radio. The little guy seemed to have completely forgotten the previous unhappiness, so when she heard Chun-Shi sing, she immediately laughed and clapped her hands. Papa sings well. It's so good. How good is it? It's better than him. Little mouth is so sweet. Come, give Papa MUA. What are you doing? You're driving. Pay attention to the road. For a moment, the car was full of the family's laughter. Hard to leave. Hard to leave. Hold on tight. The vast life is like the wilderness, like a child can lean on his father's shoulder who wants to get off the car. There are always some things that are hard to leave. Common sense is so inescapable no matter how cold the world is thinking of this bicycle. There is still happiness to be borrowed. Chapter 266. In the blink of an eye, it was March 2nd. It was the 15th day of the first lunar month, the Lantern Festival. The little girl did not like to watch the gala performances on TV, so the family went out together after dinner. Where were they going? Of course, they were going to enjoy the lanterns. The Lantern Festival began more than 2,000 years ago in the Han Dynasty and had always been a major festival in Huaxia. According to the ancient customs, the new year was only truly over after the Lantern Festival. However, the pace of life was getting faster and faster. Even though the legal holiday stipulated that people would only go to work on the 7th day, many private enterprises still required people to start work on the 5th day. Among them, there were even more, such as the catering and entertainment industry. They might open for business on the eve of the new year, so the employees naturally could not rest. Such a pace of life directly led to the Lantern Festival almost following in the footsteps of the Dragon Boat Festival. With the decline of the Lantern Festival, the lively scene described by Xian Qiji in Green Jade Case, Yuanxi was naturally no longer as lively as before. The east wind blossoms 1,000 trees, blowing down the stars like rain. The fragrance of precious horses and carts fills the road. The sound of Feng Shao moves. The light of a pot turns. Fish and dragons dance in the night. Moths flutter in the wind, inging and laughing in the wind. He searched for her thousands of times in the crowd, but when he looked back, she was at the fire. Today was Friday. Although the public institutions were on holiday, Most private enterprises still had to work tomorrow. In addition, everyone might be tired of playing during the new year, so the Wuho Temple Street was not as lively as it was during the Spring Festival. After leaving the house, the family took a taxi and went straight to the Panda Lantern Festival. The moon on the 15th was full and round, but what was more dazzling than the moon was the colorful Lantern Festival. Because they set off late, by the time Chun-Shi and the rest arrived at the Lantern Festival, it was already a 10-mile-long street with brilliant lights. As soon as they got out of the car, the fragrance of magnolia drifted to the tip of everyone's nose in the breeze. The little girl sniffed the fragrance in the air and turned her head to see the entrance of the Lantern Festival. There were a few panda lanterns outside the Lantern Festival. Although they were ugly and cute, they made her shout excitedly, "Papa, look! Panda! Panda!" In fact, to this little girl, there was not much difference between going to the Lantern Festival and going to the zoo. She was dazzled by the colorful lanterns in all kinds of shapes and sizes. She chattered excitedly all the way. In Chun-Shi's eyes, this Lantern Festival was somewhat similar to the Earth Temple Fair. Chapter 267. As soon as the family got off the plane and walked into the terminal, it began to drizzle. Just a moment ago, the sky was clear, but now it suddenly became drizzling. And this sudden spring rain seemed to be a ceremony to welcome the return of their family. Perhaps it was because she had slept on the plane, so when the little guy got off the plane, his lively and energetic appearance came back. Therefore, the little thing did not ask Chun-Shi to hold her. Instead, she jumped and ran in the corridor with her short legs. Seeing her excited look, the couple quickly followed behind her, hand in hand. If they ignored the little girl in front of them, the two of them now looked like a couple who came to Zhonghai for their honeymoon. It was impossible to tell that they were an old couple with a 5-year-old child. The little girl ran and jumped. After running for a while, she made a sharp turn and directly lay in front of the floor-to-ceiling window of the terminal. Then, she looked at the planes in front of her and said excitedly, "Papa, look! That plane is running." Chun-Shi came to the little girl's side. After touching her head with a smile, he put his hand on her back and pushed her out step by step. While walking, Chun-Shi asked with a smile, "See, didn't you just get on the plane? How do you feel?" The little thing seemed to like being pushed by her father, so she leaned back and did not fall down because of the support of Chun-Shi's palm. Then, she lay on Chun-Shi's palm. Then, under the push of Chun-Shi, like a master, she slowly walked forward with her short legs. "I like it. I like to fly." Looking at the bright smile on the little girl's face, Chun-Shi could not help but look at Qin Ruoying and smile. This child is so likable. The airport was so big that it took more than 10 minutes to walk out of the station. Even though there was a sidewalk elevator, the little thing was still tired of standing. So she turned around and raised her hands to Chun-Shi. Without needing her to say anything, Chun-Shi immediately squatted down and then hugged her in his arms. The higher one stood, the further one could see. Therefore, when she sat in Chun-Shi's arms, she pointed to exit 3 and asked in confusion, "Papa, what are they doing?" Chun-Shi looked in the direction the little fellow was pointing and saw 2 rows of burly men in black suits standing in front of the gate of the number 3 exit. That murderous aura was like that of a gang welcoming their boss home at the entrance of a prison. "He should be here to pick me up." "What's that?" "Let me give you an example. Let's say you take a plane to Chengdu alone. Grandma is afraid that you won't be able to find your way, so she comes to the airport to pick you up in advance. This is called picking you up." Oh, the little fellow nodded as if she understood. Then, she asked doubtfully, "Then who's coming to pick us up today?" They were still young, except that they no longer had the innocence of their school days. Everything seemed to be the same as before. The little girl lay on Chun-Shi's shoulder and looked around. Her cute little appearance immediately attracted a lot of envious eyes. Ignoring the astonished gazes of the bystanders, the family of three leisurely walked on the forest path. That tree, that lake, that pavilion, that building, it seemed to be the same as it was 10 years ago. They wandered aimlessly around their alma mater. It was not until they came to the playground that she suddenly remembered the magnificent feat of covering the playground with roses. She would always remember that scene. In the sea of roses, Ring, dressed in white, was like a beautiful butterfly. Under everyone's astonished eyes, she flew directly into his arms. That should be the most glorious moment of his life, right? Perhaps sensing the sudden smile on Chun-Chi's face, Ring asked with a smile, "What's wrong? Did you think of something good?" Hearing this, Chun-Chi immediately squeezed her hand and asked with a smile, "Isn't it all because of you? Is it? Isn't it? Are you blaming me? How is that possible? I can't wait to do it again. TSK, that feeling, it's great. Look at how happy you are." The couple sat in the stands and showed their affection unscrupulously while the little guy jumped around them. A football game was being held on the playground. The little guy imitated the other spectators and shouted cheers from time to time. He looked very excited. After sitting for a while, Chun-Chi suddenly hugged Ring's slender waist, then looked in her eyes and asked with a little confusion, "Ying, actually I have a question to ask you." What's a question? Why did you like me in the first place?" After hearing what he said, Ring was stunned on the spot. She could not help but ask, "Why do you ask that?" Hearing this, Chun-Chi shook his head and sighed. "I don't think I'm good enough for you." Of course, this sentence was not referring to the current him, but to the past him. Therefore, Chun-Chi had always been very puzzled. What kind of luck did he have to be favored by the goddess? Could it be Ring really had the ability to predict the future? Did she know that he had potential? Of course, Ring did not have the ability to predict the future. Therefore, after hearing Chun-Chi's words, she could not help but smile. After reaching out and touching Chun-Chi's cheek, she said slightly mischievously, "Then you have to ask Yulao, why did he put my red string on your hand? Then I have to go to Yulao's temple and burn incense to repay the vow. I have to thank him for giving me such a good wife." Fate was a kind of fate. The reason why the two of them were together was perhaps because fate had arranged for them to be together.